The night around you is quiet now, and that is exactly the kind of quiet this story wants. Settle into it. Let your shoulders soften into the mattress. Let your breathing slow, because tonight we are going back to a time long before beds, before walls, before anyone could close their eyes and simply trust the dark to hold them. For most of the time our species has existed, closing your eyes completely was not something you could always afford. A shift in the grass, a call answered by another call closer than the last, the slow drop in body heat once the fire burns low. For nearly the whole of human history, sleep was not a guarantee. It was a negotiation made fresh every single night between a body that desperately needed rest and a world that did not care whether you got it. Picture a woman sitting at the edge of a fire somewhere on the open grassland of Eastern Africa, tens of thousands of years before anyone writes a word down. Her children are curled against her, finally still, finally quiet, and every muscle in her body is asking her to lie down beside them. She does not. She sits a little longer, feeding a thin branch into the coals, watching the place where the firelight gives way to nothing. Somewhere out past that line, something is moving. She cannot see it. She can hear it faint and irregular, the kind of sound that might be nothing, might be everything. She has heard this sound before. Most nights it passes, some nights it does not. So she stays upright a little longer, her eyes heavy, her body running on the last edges of a long day, because the difference between rest and vigilance tonight might be the difference between her family waking up together or not waking up at all. Further off at the edge of the same firelight, another member of her group is already asleep, and beyond him another is only pretending to be. This is how it has always worked. Rest is never taken all at once. It is passed hand to hand through the night, one set of eyes closing only once another has opened. This is not a single story. It is closer to a shared inheritance repeated across hundreds of thousands of nights by people whose names were never written anywhere, whose faces we will never know, but whose exhaustion in a strange and very real way still lives in you. Because here is the quiet, curious thread running underneath tonight's story. The tiredness you feel at the end of a long day, the restlessness at 2 a.m, the strange alertness that sometimes arrives right when you most want to sleep. None of that is a modern malfunction. It is old, it is inherited. Your body still carries instructions written for a world that no longer exists, a world where full uninterrupted sleep was a luxury very few humans ever actually had. Tonight we are going to walk through that world together, from the first watchful nights around open fires, through villages ruled by the rhythm of crops, through candlelight and factory bells and electric light that never lets the sky go fully dark, all the way to right now, to you lying in a bed built for comfort. Your ancestors could not have imagined, and still somehow feeling tired in ways they would have understood completely. Before we go further into that story, if this is the kind of history you've been looking for, something real, something patient, something that treats you like an intelligent adult, rather than an audience to be startled awake, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who are looking for exactly this. And if you have a moment, leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what drew you to a story about something as quiet as human exhaustion. I read every one and I am genuinely curious. For now, let yourself get comfortable and let us begin. Because that woman by the fire, watchful and exhausted in equal measure, was not unusual. She was in almost every meaningful sense normal. For the overwhelming majority of the time human beings have existed on this earth, we lived in small mobile groups with no walls, no locked doors, no guarantee that the dark hours would pass without incident. Sleep researchers who study surviving hunter-gatherer and semi-nomadic communities today Groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, whose way of life still echoes something much older, have found patterns that would look strange to most modern sleepers. Rest tends to come in pieces rather than one long unbroken stretch. Someone is very often awake or half awake listening. Researchers tracking sleep among these communities over weeks at a time have found that at almost no point during the night is the entire group unconscious together. There is nearly always at least one person in a state of partial wakefulness, whether they intend to be or not. The evidence remains incomplete since no observation today can perfectly recreate conditions from tens of thousands of years ago. But what does survive in both the archaeological record and in these living communities points toward the same conclusion again and again. Deep, uninterrupted 8-hour sleep, the kind so many of us quietly feel we are failing to achieve, may never have been the natural human default at all. It may be closer to a modern invention than a lost natural state. Think for a moment about what a single night actually required of an early human body. It required warmth to be maintained without central heating, which meant tending a fire, which meant someone had to stay conscious enough to feed it. It required awareness of predators, since lions, hyenas, and other large carnivores were a real and constant presence throughout the regions where our species evolved. It required social vigilance too, an understanding that other groups of humans, competing for the same land and the same resources, were not always friendly. Infants needed feeding through the night, often more than once, and a mother's sleep bent itself entirely around a small body's hunger. Illness and injury with no medicine beyond what could be found nearby meant that a fever in the night could turn fatal by morning if no one was awake to notice. Layer all of that together, and a strange, almost startling picture begins to form. For most of human history, the good sleepers in the sense we use that phrase today may not have survived especially well at all. The people whose genes made it forward into you and me were very often the light sleepers, the easily woken, the ones whose bodies stayed just alert enough to notice when something in the dark had changed. Some researchers even suggest that this is why so many of us wake naturally in the deep hours of the night, still even now safe behind locked doors and heated walls. The body has not yet been told that it is allowed to stop listening. That is the quiet, strange inheritance sitting underneath tonight's story. Not a flaw, not a modern failure of discipline or willpower. An old, careful design built across an almost unimaginable stretch of time for a world where full unconsciousness carried real risk. And as we move forward tonight from these earliest watchful nights toward the first villages, the first fields, the first schedules that human beings ever imposed on themselves, you will start to see exactly how that ancient vigilance never really left us. It simply changed shape, following us out of the grasslands into farmhouses, into factories, into the glow of a screen. At midnight, always a little too alert, always just slightly unwilling to fully let go. It followed us, in fact, all the way to tonight, to this very room, to you. The hills of what is now northern Syria hold the beginning of something no one recognizes as historic while it is happening. Roughly 12,000 years ago, in a landscape of wild grasses and scattered oak, small groups of people who have always moved with the seasons begin instead to stay. They notice which grass stalks hold their seeds longest without scattering, and they begin almost without meaning to favouring those stalks gathering them, scattering some of their seed close to camp instead of far away. It is a small, patient, repeated choice made across many years and many hands, and it becomes the most consequential decision our species has ever made without knowing it was a decision at all. Agriculture arrives slowly, and it arrives everywhere differently, in the river valleys of the Fertile Crescent, along the Yangtze in the highlands of Mexico, each place finding its own crop, its own rhythm, its own reasons. But everywhere it takes root, it carries the same quiet cost, one that took archaeologists a surprisingly long time to fully recognize. For generations, the story told about farming was a story of progress, of humans finally escaping the uncertainty of the hunt and stepping into something safer, steadier, easier. The bones tell a different story. Skeletons recovered from early farming communities are on average shorter than the skeletons of the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Their teeth show more decay. Their joints show more wear, more repetitive stress, more of the specific damage that comes from the same motion performed thousands upon thousands of times. Bending, grinding grain by hand for hours, hauling water. The picture that emerges is not one of ease. It is one of a body working harder for less varied food in exchange for something else entirely, something that would only pay off much later, and only for descendants who would never know the trade had been made on their behalf. That something else was abundance eventually, and it was also permanence, but in the meantime what agriculture actually delivered immediately, and without exception, was work. Constant, cyclical, unforgiving work tied not to how a body felt on any given morning, but to what the season demanded regardless. A hunter-gatherer, when tired, can rest, can wait, can let a hunt happen tomorrow instead of today. A field of ripening grain offers no such patience. It ripens when it ripens, and if it is not harvested within a narrow window, it is lost along with the labour of an entire season, and in a bad year the food that would carry a family through winter. This is the quiet structural difference that begins to reshape human exhaustion at its root. Work is no longer something a body chooses to do when strength allows. It becomes something owed on a schedule set by wheat and barley and rice, not by the person doing the owing. Picture a young man somewhere along the banks of the Euphrates, perhaps 4,000 years after that first deliberate planting, near the hills of Syria. He rises before the sky has fully lightened, because the heat of the afternoon will make the heaviest work unbearable, and because the canal that waters his family's plot needs clearing before the water is released from the main channel upstream. His hands are already thick with callus by his early 20s, his lower back carrying a permanent, familiar ache that his grandfather, a hunter in his youth, likely never knew in the same way. He works the earth with a wooden hoe, then moves to check the small mud brick dam that channels water into his field, adjusting it by hand, because a poorly timed flood can drown young shoots as easily as drought can kill them. By midday the sun is high enough that continuing to work in it risks his health. So he retreats into shade for a few hours, not out of leisure but out of necessity, and returns again in the cooling hours of late afternoon to finish what the morning left undone. Tomorrow will ask the same of him, so will the day after. The seasons do not negotiate, and neither in a sense does the ground he's come to depend on. What makes this shift so strange when you sit with it is that agriculture did not arrive because it was easier. Scholars still debate exactly why early human communities across such different regions of the world made a trade that by nearly every physical measure available to archaeology made daily life harder rather than better. Some point to population pressure, to hunting grounds growing too crowded to reliably feed everyone the old way. Some point to climate shifts at the end of the last ice age, which made certain wild grains suddenly abundant enough to be worth the gamble of staying in one place to tend them. Others suggest it was never a single clean decision at all, but a slow accumulation of small, reasonable choices, each one making sense in its own moment that only in hindsight adds up to something as sweeping as the invention of farming. What the evidence does make clear is that the people living through this transition were not choosing an easier life. They were choosing, whether they understood it this way or not, a more predictable one in exchange for a body that would carry far more daily labour than the one their ancestors had known. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settled architecture creates, one that mobile life had never really demanded in the same way. When you can walk away from a depleted patch of land when your home is wherever your group happens to be standing, your labour is distributed differently. often described by researchers studying present-day mobile foraging communities as involving fewer total working hours across a week than farming typically requires. A field, by contrast, cannot be walked away from without losing everything invested in it. Ties a person to one place permanently, and that permanence becomes its own quiet form of obligation. You work not only because you're hungry today, but because the field itself as an idea, as a commitment already made, requires tending regardless of how you feel this particular morning. Historians sometimes describe this as the moment human beings began working for the future in a way no other point in our history had ever really demanded. And the future, unlike an animal you might track and kill in a single afternoon, is patient and endless and never fully satisfied. Villages grow up around these fields, and with villages comes something else that would have been almost unthinkable to that woman by the fire, in an earlier chapter of this story, watching for movement at the edge of the light. Surplus, stored grain kept through winter that someone now has to guard, where a mobile group's wealth was mostly carried on their backs and therefore mostly safe from theft. Simply by being difficult to steal in bulk, a granary sitting still in one place, full of a year's food, becomes a target. Some of the earliest fortified structures archaeologists have uncovered are not palaces or temples at all. They are storage buildings built with walls thick enough to keep a season's harvest safe from both weather and other hungry humans. Exhaustion in this new world is no longer only physical. It carries with it a new kind of low, constant watchfulness, a worry not about predators moving in the grass, but about neighbours, about strangers, about the uncomfortable new reality that having enough now means someone else might have less, and might come looking for what you have stored. And so the body that once rested in pieces around a fire alert for danger but otherwise free to fold into sleep once the sun went down, now finds itself tied to something with no natural stopping point. A field does not end at dusk. It waits silently for the next morning, and the morning after that for years, for generations, each one inheriting the same unbroken obligation from the one before. The rhythm of the wild, unpredictable, but also in its own way forgiving, gives way to the rhythm of the calendar, rigid and exacting measured. Now not in the movement of herds or the ripening of wild fruit, but in planting dates and harvest windows that leave almost no room for a body simply needing rest. It is a trade our species made slowly, unevenly, and largely without realizing what it was giving up, and it would not be the last time exhaustion changed shape without anyone quite noticing, until long after the change had already taken hold. There is one more piece of this transformation worth sitting with, because it rarely makes it into the tidy version of this story. Agriculture did not distribute its new burden of labour evenly across a household. Children who among mobile foraging groups had often enjoyed a long, relatively unhurried childhood became economically useful almost as soon as their small hands could manage a task weeding, scaring birds from ripening grain, carrying water in vessels sized for their strength. Women's labour, already considerable in most human societies, expanded further to include processing grain into edible food. A task so time-consuming in the ancient world that some historians estimate it could occupy several hours of every single day, grinding by hand what a modern kitchen accomplishes in moments. And when the harvest failed, as it periodically and inevitably did, the exhaustion of overwork gave way to something worse. The specific grinding exhaustion of hunger itself, a season of diminished strength spent still trying to perform the same unforgiving labour on a body that had too little fuel to spare. Famine in a way that simply did not exist for most mobile foraging peoples who could follow food rather than wait for it, becomes from this point forward a recurring character in the human story, and with it a new and darker register of tiredness that has nothing to do with a long day and everything to do with a body slowly running out of what it needs. Somewhere in that same stretch of centuries in the villages growing thick along riverbanks and hillsides, Another shift is beginning to stir quieter still, one that has less to do with what the body does during the day, and everything to do with what happens once the fields have gone dark and the work has finally briefly stopped. Sound is the first thing to change when a village goes quiet. During the day, a settlement hums with movement tools, striking stone animals calling children shouting across open ground. But once the light drops low enough that work becomes impossible, a different kind of attention takes over, one built not around labour, but around listening. For a very long stretch of human history, sleep was rarely something a single person experienced alone. It was communal, layered, deliberately shared, and this was not simply a matter of preference or affection, though it was often that too. It was a matter of survival carried forward from the same instincts that had a woman by a fire watching the dark for movement. A body sleeping by itself in a small dwelling with only its own senses to rely on was a body with no backup, no second set of ears, no one to wake if something outside the walls began to move with intention. So people slept together often, many to a single room, sometimes many to a single raised platform of packed earth or woven reeds, bodies arranged close enough that warmth passed easily between them and that no single person carried the full weight of vigilance alone. Archaeologists working at some of the earliest known permanent settlements, places like Çatalhöyük in what is now central Turkey, have uncovered something that still surprises people when they hear it for the first time. This settlement, home to thousands of people roughly 9,000 years ago, was built with no streets at all and almost no doors at ground level. Houses sat pressed directly against one another, wall to wall, and residents moved across the rooftops instead, entering their own homes through an opening in the ceiling, climbing down a ladder into the room below. At night, that ladder became something close to a drawbridge. Pull it up or simply stop using it, and a family's sleeping space became remarkably difficult for anyone unwelcome to reach without considerable noise and effort. The arrangement meant an entire community sleeping just beneath a shared rooftop landscape was in a strange way sleeping together, even while apart. Each household a small island, but islands close enough that a disturbance in one would very likely be heard in the next. A similar instinct shows up in an entirely different corner of the ancient world. At Skara Brae, a Neolithic settlement on the windswept coast of Orkney in Scotland dating back roughly 5,000 years, archaeologists uncovered stone houses connected by covered passageways, allowing residents to move between homes without ever stepping into the exposed, often brutal weather outside. Inside each house, stone box beds line the walls built directly into the structure itself, filled once with heather or straw for softness, close enough to the central hearth that no sleeper drifted far from its warmth or its light. The people of Skara Brae, separated from those early farmers along the Euphrates by thousands of miles, and an entirely different climate, arrived independently at strikingly similar answers to the same basic problem. Keep bodies close. Keep the fire visible. Keep the night from ever feeling entirely unwatched. This closeness had a texture to it that is difficult for a modern listener, used to a door that locks and a room that belongs to no one else to fully picture. Inside many early homes, the hearth sat at the centre, and bodies arranged themselves around it in a rough circle, the warmest, most protected positions typically given to the youngest children and the oldest members of the household, those least able to withstand a cold night if the fire burned low. Sleep in this arrangement was rarely deep and uninterrupted for everyone at once. Someone stirred to feed the fire, someone else half woke at the sound, checked instinctively that the sound belonged to a known body, and not an unknown one, and let themselves drift back down. Infants sleeping against a parent rather than in a separate space woke, and were tended to within moments before real distress could build. The entire arrangement functioned less like individual sleep, and more like a single shared organism. breathing and half waking and settling again as a unit through the night. There is a real cost to living this way, and it is worth naming honestly because life was brutal has never meant pretending the past was gentler than it actually was. Privacy in the sense so many people today consider essential to real rest simply did not exist for most of human history, and its absence was not experienced as deprivation in the way it might be felt now because there was no comparison point to make it feel like a loss. But it did mean that illness spread quickly through a household sharing close quarters and close air. It meant that a restless child, a coughing elder, a partner, turning over again and again was something every sleeper in the room absorbed whether they wanted to or not. The burden of this vigilance, moreover, was rarely distributed equally. In household after household across cultures and centuries, it was overwhelmingly mothers who carried the heaviest share of broken sleep, waking not only for their own alertness to danger, but for the very specific, very physical demands of a nursing infant, a demand that did not pause for exhaustion, illness, or grief. A mother's night in most agricultural societies for which any record survives was rarely a single stretch of anything. It was a string of partial risings strung together across the dark hours repeated for years at a time across multiple children, in a way that left an entire category of people carrying a form of chronic compounding tiredness that the rest of the household simply did not share to the same degree. Scholars who study sleep in traditional and historical societies note that this kind of fragmented, communally interrupted rest was for nearly the entire span of human existence simply what sleep was. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how this pattern varied across different climates and cultures, since so much of it left no physical trace for archaeology to recover, but ethnographic accounts from societies that maintained communal sleeping arrangements well into the modern era describe something remarkably consistent. A night broken into pieces by necessity rarely mourned, because no one alive had ever known anything else. What makes this worth sitting with tonight is a quiet, almost uncomfortable question it raises. So much of how exhaustion is discussed in the present day treats interrupted sleep as a malfunction to be corrected, a problem with a body or a mattress or a bedtime routine. But for the overwhelming majority of human history, interrupted, shared, partially vigilant sleep was not a malfunction at all. It was the design. A person who slept too deeply, too separately, too unaware of the room around them was in a meaningful sense taking on more risk than their neighbours, not less. The instincts many people carry today, a kind of low hum of alertness that makes truly deep, uninterrupted rest feel elusive, even in a locked, quiet, perfectly safe bedroom, may be an inheritance from tens of thousands of generations who genuinely could not afford to switch that alertness off completely even while asleep. There is a strange, modern echo of this old design that sleep scientists have only recently managed to measure directly. When a person sleeps in an unfamiliar place for the first time, a hotel room, a friend's guest bed, one half of the brain has been shown through careful monitoring in sleep laboratories to remain measurably more alert than the other, almost as though some ancient portion of the mind refuses to fully stand down until it has confirmed the new surroundings are safe. Researchers have come to call this the first night effect, and while it is usually described today as a minor inconvenience, a reason travellers sleep poorly on their first night away from home, it reads in the context of everything that came before it less like an inconvenience and more like a fossil. A small, still functioning piece of the same instinct that once kept a mother upright by a fire quietly persisting in a species that has otherwise forgotten why it is there at all. Night itself beyond the walls of any single home carried its own particular danger, one that shaped settlement life in ways still visible in the archaeological record. Raiding between rival villages competing for land, livestock, or stored grain was a real and recurring threat in many early agricultural societies, and raids overwhelmingly favoured the cover of darkness. A community caught fully asleep With no one listening for the specific sound of unfamiliar footsteps or the particular silence of dogs gone suddenly quiet was a community at its most vulnerable. Some of the earliest defensive walls discovered by archaeologists predating anything resembling organized warfare in the way later history would define it seem built less to withstand a prolonged siege than to simply buy a sleeping village those precious extra minutes, enough time for someone to wake to raise an alarm, to gather what could be gathered and run if running became necessary. Night watch in this context stops being a poetic idea and becomes an actual assigned exhausting duty rotated among able-bodied members of a household or a village, each person giving up a portion of their own rest so that the group as a whole could sleep with slightly less fear. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from this arrangement, one that never fully leaves a person, even on the nights they are not the one standing watch. Anthropologists who study communities that still practice some version of rotating night vigilance describe a phenomenon where sleep quality suffers for everyone in a household, not only for the person formerly on duty, because the entire group's nervous system remains tuned even unconsciously to the possibility of being woken. This is likely one of the oldest and most persistent contributors to human exhaustion across our entire history as a species, older even than agriculture itself, and it never really disappeared. It simply moved. The specific fear of a raid faded in many places as settlements grew larger and more organized, but the underlying architecture, it left behind a body that sleeps while some quiet corner of itself keeps listening, carried forward into every version of human life that followed, waiting for a new source of threat, real or imagined, to attach itself to. And attach itself it did again and again across every era. This story will pass through tonight. The specific danger changes. A predator in the grass becomes a raider in the dark, becomes centuries later the fear of illness moving silently through a crowded medieval home, becomes later still the anxious pull of a glowing screen in an otherwise dark and perfectly safe modern bedroom, checked one more time before sleep can finally be trusted to arrive. The costume changes. The underlying vigilance, the same one that kept a mother upright by a fire and a family half listening around a shared hearth, does not disappear so much as it waits patiently for whatever the next era decides is worth staying a little bit awake for. Because as villages grow larger, as fields multiply and grain stores swell, and the loose, informal watchfulness of a single household stretches to cover an entire community, something new begins to take shape, something that will not simply respond to danger when it arrives, but will attempt for the first time in human history to divide the night itself into pieces that can be measured, assigned and controlled. The night that villages built for themselves, layered with watchfulness and shared warmth, was never actually sent in the way a modern bedroom aims to be. And buried inside that wakefulness is a pattern so consistent, so widely documented across an entire continent for hundreds of years, that it is almost strange how thoroughly it disappeared from common memory. For most of European history, and likely for a great deal of history elsewhere as well, though the written record survives far more richly in Europe, people did not sleep in one long unbroken stretch through the night. They slept in two, a first sleep beginning not long after dusk and a second sleep picked up again some hours later, with a waking period stretched quietly between them, often lasting an hour or more, sometimes longer. This was not insomnia. It was not a disorder or a disruption to be fixed. It was simply how a night was structured, spoken of so plainly and so often in historical documents that scholars now consider it to have been the ordinary human sleep pattern across much of pre-industrial society, right up until the final centuries before electric light reshaped everything. Picture a farmer's wife somewhere in rural France in a small stone cottage, sometime in the 1500s, waking not to alarm, but to the ordinary expected pull of her own body some hours after the household settled for its first sleep. The room around her is dark, the fire reduced to a faint orange glow, her husband breathing steadily beside her, a child curled at the foot of the bed. She does not reach for anything, does not check any measure of the hour, because there is nothing to check and no need to. She simply lies awake for a while, turning over a dream that had just woken her one, involving a departed relative, and she takes it seriously in the way people of her time generally did, sifting it for meaning with the same unhurried attention a modern person might give to an unread letter. After a time, unmeasured and unhurried, her eyes grow heavy again, and she slides back into the second sleep that will carry her to dawn. Nothing about this hour felt remarkable to her. It would only come to feel remarkable centuries later to people who could no longer quite imagine a night with room in it for something so unhurried. A historian named Roger Eckerch spent years tracing this pattern through an enormous body of surviving material court depositions, medical texts, private letters, diaries, and works of literature stretching from antiquity through the early modern period. What he found was not a handful of scattered, ambiguous references. It was hundreds of them, spanning centuries, describing first sleep and second sleep with the same casual certainty someone today might use to describe breakfast and lunch. A physician writing a medical guide might advise readers on which activities were best suited to the hour after a first sleep. A court record might note that a crime occurred sometime between first sleep and second sleep, using the phrase not as poetry, but as an ordinary marker of time, the way a modern witness might say something happened around midnight. Even Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 1300s, includes a passing reference to a character's first sleep, tossed into the narrative with no explanation needed at all because his readers would have understood it instantly, the same way a reader today needs no explanation for the phrase lunch break. The language itself carried the pattern's ordinariness. French sources of the period use the term dorveil, a word blending, sleep and waking to describe this in-between state, treating it as its own distinct condition of consciousness, rather than simply an interruption of something else. Italian and Spanish sources reflect similar phrasing. English texts speak plainly of first sleep and second sleep, without any of the apologetic or clinical tone a modern speaker might reach for when describing a broken night. This linguistic ease matters because language tends to develop precise, comfortable vocabulary for things people experience constantly, and without shame the way a fishing community develops dozens of words for weather that a landlocked town never needs. A culture does not build casual, widely shared vocabulary around something considered a problem. It builds that vocabulary around something considered simply part of how a night unfolds. What did people actually do during that waking hour between the two sleeps? The answer pieced together from the surviving record is almost startlingly ordinary, and that ordinariness is part of what makes it so quietly moving. Some prayed, and religious guidance from the period sometimes specifically recommended this hour as particularly well suited to devotion. The mind calm, the household silent, the distractions of daylight hours entirely absent. Some simply lay in the dark and thought, turning over the events of the day or the dreams that had just interrupted, in a mental state some historians have compared to a kind of natural built-in version of meditation, one the human mind seems to have arrived at without anyone designing it on purpose. A number of historical accounts go further still, describing the waking hour as a period particularly suited to thought that daylight crowded with obligation and noise rarely allowed. Some writers of the period describe using it to work through a difficult problem, a dispute to be settled, a decision weighing on them, finding that the quiet, unhurried darkness of the dorveil offered a kind of clarity the busy hours of daylight could not. A few surviving accounts even describe it as a time for composing verse or working out the shape of an idea. The mind loosened just enough by sleep to wander somewhere daylight logic would not have permitted. It is a small detail, easy to overlook, but it suggests something worth pausing on. The waking hour was not experienced purely as lost time to be endured until sleep returned. For at least some people across a very long stretch of history, it was quietly productive, even treasured a private hour belonging to no one else in the house. Some tended small tasks that required only firelight mending. A torn garment, checking on a sick child, banking the coals so the fire would hold until morning. Married couples, several surviving texts suggest with a certain gentle bluntness, often use the waking hour for intimacy, a detail some historians point to as one explanation for why the period was so consistently and specifically remembered in ordinary written record, rather than fading into the background noise of daily life. And some simply talked quietly to whoever else in the house happened to be awake at the same time, the kind of unhurried conversation that daylight filled with labour and obligation rarely allowed for. There is something worth sitting with in how completely this pattern has vanished from common awareness, given how recently in the scope of human history it was simply normal. Ekirch's research suggests the shift away from segmented sleep began in earnest with the spread of artificial light into ordinary homes, and the change did not arrive evenly. It began almost without exception among the wealthy and growing cities. Those who could afford to burn candles or oil well past the hour, an ordinary household would have already been settled into first sleep. Urban nightlife coffee houses in particular, which spread rapidly across European cities from the 1600s onward, gave the wealthy a new and fashionable reason to stay awake later, socializing, conducting business, reading, by purchased light, and as bedtime crept later and later for those who could afford it, the natural gap for a first sleep simply compressed out of existence, replaced by a single later block of rest that more closely resembles what most people consider normal sleep today. Rural and working households without the means to burn light long into the evening held on to the older segmented pattern considerably longer, sometimes for another century or more, a quiet but telling reminder that even something as intimate and biological as how a person sleeps has throughout history often been shaped as much by the wealth and access as by the body's own needs. By the early 20th century, biphasic sleep had faded almost entirely from Western life, and within only a few generations the very memory that people had ever slept any other way faded along with it. A pattern maintained for centuries, perhaps for a great deal longer than that, vanished so thoroughly that when Ekirch first began presenting his research describing something that had once been utterly unremarkable, many people reacted with genuine surprise, even disbelief at the idea that their own recent ancestors slept in a shape so different from their own. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how universal this pattern was outside of Europe, and scholars continue to debate how much of it reflects a truly ancient human default, and how much was shaped by the specific conditions of pre-industrial European life. The cold, the expense of light, the particular rhythms of agricultural labour discussed earlier in this story. Some researchers point to modern experiments in which participants placed in conditions of extended darkness, closer to what a pre-industrial winter night might have offered, naturally settled into something resembling this same two-part sleep pattern within a matter of weeks, suggesting the shape may run deeper than culture alone, closer to something built into human biology itself and simply waiting for the right conditions to reveal it. Others caution that a small number of controlled experiments cannot fully confirm what an entire civilization actually did across centuries and vastly different circumstances, and that segmented sleep documented so richly in Europe may not translate neatly onto every culture and climate this story will eventually touch. What feels most striking, though, is not the debate over origins, but the tone the historical record itself takes toward this waking hour. There is no anxiety in it, no sense in the surviving diaries and letters that lying awake in the dark for an hour was something to fear or fight against. It was simply part of the night, expected, unremarkable, sometimes even treasured. Compare that for a moment to how a modern person often responds to waking at 2 or 3 in the morning. The quiet dread of glancing at a clock, The mental math of hours lost the frustration that can itself make returning to sleep even harder. Is it possible that some of what modern life has come to treat as the sleep problem is at least in part an old and entirely ordinary rhythm, one the body still quietly remembers meeting a world that no longer has any patience for it? Some sleep researchers today, working with people placed in conditions of extended winter darkness for weeks at a time, have observed exactly this two-part pattern re-emerge naturally, along with reports of a calmer, less anxious relationship to the waking hour itself, once the sleeper understood it was neither strange nor a failure, but simply the shape a night takes when it is finally given enough room to unfold. Because that shift from a night unhurried enough to hold two separate sleeps and a wakeful hour between them, to a night squeezed into a single block and guarded jealously against interruption, did not happen by accident, and it did not happen quickly. It happened alongside something else entirely, something that was in its own quiet way, learning to reach into the dark and tell people for the first time in the whole of human history precisely what hour it was. That something had already been taking shape for centuries in the quiet stone towers of monasteries and the growing marketplaces of medieval towns long before it ever reached into an ordinary bedroom. And its arrival would prove to be one of the most consequential, least dramatic revolutions human exhaustion has ever quietly endured. The stone towers of medieval monasteries hold tucked inside their thick walls one of the strangest and least remembered inventions in the history of human rest, a discipline so demanding that it makes even the watchfulness of a Neolithic hearth seem almost gentle by comparison. Long before mechanical clocks existed anywhere in the world, Christian monastic life in medieval Europe had already organized itself around a rigid schedule of prayer that divided both day and night into fixed points called the canonical hours. Matins the first of these fell in the deep middle of the night, often called for somewhere between 1 and 3 in the morning, requiring monks to rise from sleep, walk through cold stone corridors and gather to pray, before returning to bed for what remained of the night. Lauds followed near dawn. Then came prime terce, sext nun, vespers, and compline spaced across the day and evening, each one requiring a monk to stop whatever he was doing and turn his attention to prayer. A monk's sleep, in other words, was not simply interrupted by circumstance, the way a farmer's might be by an ailing animal or a mother's by a hungry infant. It was interrupted by design deliberately as an act of devotion, on a fixed schedule repeated identically every night regardless of season, weather, or how tired any individual monk happened to feel. Picture a young monk somewhere in a monastery in northern France, perhaps in the 1200s, roused from sleep in the deepest, coldest hour of the night by the sound of a bell or the touch of an appointed brother's hand on his shoulder. He rises in darkness, his breath visible in the unheated stone of the dormitory, and pulls on the same coarse robe he wore the day before, his body still heavy with the sleep he has just been pulled from. He walks with his brothers along a covered passage toward the chapel. Feet bare or in thin sandals against cold stone, the only light coming from a handful of candles at the altar ahead. He kneels, he prays, his mind only partly present. Still tethered to the dream, this bell has just interrupted, and when the prayer ends, he walks back the same cold passage to whatever sleep remains before dawn calls him again. This happens tonight. It happened last night. It will happen tomorrow night, and the night after that, for as long as he wears this robe, an entire life built quite deliberately around a body that is never permitted to fully uninterruptedly rest. This raises a question worth sitting with for a moment. If a monastic life built around waking in the middle of the night every night for prayer was considered not a hardship to be endured, but a discipline worth pursuing, what does that suggest about how differently earlier centuries understood the relationship between sleep and virtue? Rest in this context was never treated as something owed to the body without condition. It was something the body was permitted, within limits, set by a higher obligation, and interrupting it deliberately rather than avoiding interruption, was in some settings considered the more admirable path. To keep this demanding schedule accurate through the darkest hours when the sun offered no guidance at all, monasteries needed some reliable way to mark the passage of time. Early solutions were remarkably physical and remarkably human. A monk might be assigned to stay awake and simply watch a burning candle marked with lines, each line representing a fixed interval, waking his brothers when the flame reached the appropriate mark. Some communities relied on water clocks, vessels that dripped at a steady rate into a marked container, the level offering a rough but workable measure of elapsed time. Still others depended on nothing more sophisticated than one designated brother's internal sense of the hour, trained over years of repetition, until his body itself became something close to a timepiece, waking reliably without any external prompt at all. The evidence surviving from this period is genuinely mixed on how these earliest methods actually performed, and scholars continue to debate how consistently medieval monasteries managed to keep true to their schedules before more reliable mechanisms arrived, but what is not in doubt is the sheer determination behind the effort. An entire religious life organized around denying the body an uninterrupted night for the sake of something considered more important than rest. It was out of this exact need, the need to mark time reliably through hours with no sunlight to guide them, that one of the most consequential inventions in the entire history of human exhaustion begins to take shape. Sometime in the final decades of the 1200s, in monasteries scattered across parts of Europe, the first mechanical clocks appear, weight-driven devices using a mechanism called an escapement to release energy in small regular increments, producing something no water clock or burning candle ever could, a genuinely even self-sustaining measure of time that did not need a monk to sit and watch it. These earliest mechanical clocks did not yet have faces or hands in the way a modern person would picture a clock. Their entire purpose for decades was simply to ring a bell at the correct moment, calling monks to prayer with a reliability no human watchman could quite match through an entire freezing winter night. What happened next is where this story quietly turns a corner that would eventually touch every human life in Europe, whether they ever set foot inside a monastery or not. The bell built to call monks to prayer proved to the merchants and craftsmen and town councils watching from just beyond the monastery walls, remarkably useful for an entirely different purpose. A town that could hear a reliable, regularly repeating bell suddenly had a shared, public measure of time available to everyone within earshot, not just to those following a religious schedule. By the 1300s, mechanical clocks had begun appearing in the towers of town halls and cathedrals across parts of Europe, no longer marking only hours of prayer, but hours of the market opening, the city gates closing, the curfew beginning, the start and end of a working day. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it clearly explained. Before mechanical clocks became common, an hour was not a fixed unchanging length of time at all. Under the older system inherited from antiquity, daylight itself was divided into 12 equal parts regardless of the actual length of the day, which meant an hour in the long days of summer was considerably longer in real terms than an hour in the short days of winter. Time bent to match the sun rather than the other way around. Mechanical clocks change this quietly but permanently, introducing the fixed, unchanging hour that every modern person now takes entirely for granted, the same 60 minutes, whether it is the height of June or the depth of December. This shift, easy to overlook because it happened so gradually and so long ago, represents one of the most fundamental changes in how human beings have ever related to their own days. Time stopped being something the sun handed down each morning, generous or stingy depending on the season, and became instead something fixed, external, and entirely indifferent to whether a body felt ready for what it demanded. Consider for a moment what this shift meant for someone with no monastery obligations at all, an ordinary craftsman or labourer living within earshot of a town clock. His grandfather had worked by task and by daylight, rising with the sun resting, when the light failed the day's length itself, flexing gently with the seasons in a way his body had likely never questioned. He, by contrast, increasingly worked by the bell. Guild regulations in a growing number of medieval towns began specifying exact hours for labour, to begin and end, tied not to sunrise and sunset, but to the strikes of the public clock, a measure that did not care whether a winter morning was still dark or a summer evening still bright. Historians who study this transition describe it as a shift from what is sometimes called task orientation, where work continues until a job is finished, to time orientation, where work continues until a clock says it should stop regardless of whether the task itself is done. It is a subtle distinction, but its consequences run remarkably deep because a body working by task can at least in principle rest when a job allows it. A body working by the clock increasingly cannot, because the clock, unlike a finished task, never actually arrives at a natural stopping point of its own. In the cloth-producing towns of Flanders, among the most economically advanced regions of medieval Europe, this shift shows up with particular clarity in surviving guild ordinances. Weavers and other textile workers were bound to specific working hours marked by the town bell, with fines recorded for those who began late or left early, a formal monetary penalty attached for what may be the first time in European history to a worker's failure to align their own body with an external, mechanical measure of time rather than with the actual demands of the task in front of them. A weaver whose eyes ached from strain, whose hands had cramped from hours at the loom, no longer had quite the same simple option his ancestors might have had to simply stop and rest until strength returned. The bell had not finished ringing yet, and increasingly that mattered more than how his body actually felt. Public clocks once installed tended to become objects of genuine civic pride, and towns competed with one another over the elaborateness of their mechanisms, some incorporating moving figures, astronomical displays, and elaborate chimes that drew visitors from considerable distances. But underneath the spectacle sat something quieter and more consequential, a growing public expectation that time itself was now something knowable, shared, and increasingly something a person was expected to answer to. Being late in a world without shared precise time had been a somewhat flexible concept, judged loosely against the position of the sun or the rough estimate of a neighbour. Being late in a town with a public clock striking the hour for everyone to hear became something else entirely, a specific, measurable failure witnessed by anyone within range of the bell. This new civic sense of time gave rise to a figure who would walk the streets of European towns for centuries afterward, calling out the hour into the darkness for anyone still awake to hear. The night watchman, appointed and paid by many town councils from the medieval period onward, walked a set route through the streets after the town gates closed, carrying a lantern and often a bell or horn announcing the hour, and frequently a brief report on the weather or the general safety of the night. Some surviving town records preserve fragments of the actual calls these watchmen used, simple repeated phrases confirming the hour, and that all remained well offered up into empty streets, whether or not anyone was there to hear them. In a strange and rather touching way, this practice carried forward something of the same old instinct that had once kept a mother upright by a fire and a household half listening around a shared hearth, an assurance spoken aloud into the dark that someone was still watching, that the night had not yet turned dangerous, that it was safe to keep sleeping a little while longer. The watchman had simply replaced the family member on duty with a public official and the fire with a lantern, but the underlying need, an assurance against the dark, had not changed at all. This new relationship with time did not erase the older rhythms this story has already walked through tonight. The field still ripened according to the seasons the body still carried. The old inherited instinct toward broken watchful sleep the Dorveli still lingered on for generations in households too poor to own a clock or too far from a town to hear its bell. But something had shifted permanently in how human societies were beginning to think about rest and about the relationship between a person's body and the hours available to it. Sleep work, prayer. All of it was slowly being pulled out of the loose, forgiving rhythm of sun and season and pressed instead into a grid of fixed external hours, uniform and indifferent, that did not know or particularly care whether the body underneath them was ready. That grid, still relatively gentle in these early centuries, confined mostly to monastery walls, and the occasional town square, was about to be handed a kind of power no bell tower had ever possessed on its own, one that would take this same quiet, patient idea of measured time and press it for the first time in human history directly into the muscles and bones of an entire working population. The muscles and bones that measured time was about to claim belonged by the final decades of the 1700s to a very particular kind of building, rising along the rivers of northern England, one that would take everything. This story has traced so far the bell, the schedule, the fixed and indifferent hour, and multiply its reach beyond anything a medieval town crier could have imagined. Richard Arkwright's cotton mill at Cromford, built in the year 1771 along the banks of the River Derwent, is often cited by historians as one of the first factories in the modern sense of the word. And what made it revolutionary was not simply the machinery inside it. It was the decision radical for its time to keep that machinery running continuously day and night, powered by the constant, tireless flow of the river itself. A water wheel does not tire the way a human worker does, and it does not observe the old gentle rhythm of sunrise and sunset either. It simply keeps turning, and if it is to be put to full use, someone has to be present to tend it around the clock. Arkwright's solution was one of the earliest large-scale applications of a system this story has not yet properly named, though its underlying logic will feel immediately familiar. He split his workforce into 2 rotating shifts, one working through the day, another through the night, so that the mill itself never had to stop. A similar logic, driven by an entirely different kind of darkness, was unfolding underground in the coal mines that fed Britain's growing industrial furnaces. Miners working several hundred feet below the surface experienced something no farmer or weaver ever had to reckon with: a total absolute absence of natural light regardless of the hour meaning. The old distinction between day work and night work had, in a very real sense, already dissolved before the factory system ever formalized it above ground. Mine owners, recognizing that a coal seam like a water wheel did not care what time it was, began organizing miners into shifts that could keep extraction running around the clock. And by the early 1800s, some British collieries operated with barely a pause between one shift descending and the last one climbing back toward the surface. A miner's body in this environment had no sun to orient itself by at all, no dusk to signal the approach of rest, only the length of a shift and the walk home afterward, however dark or light the world above happened to be when he finally emerged. This single decision, easy to state in a single sentence, represents an enormous break from everything human exhaustion had been built around up to this point. Every rhythm this story has traced tonight, the watchfulness of early humans, the ripening of agricultural fields, the Dorvale, even the strict schedule of monastic prayer, had still ultimately deferred to the basic biological reality that a human body needs consolidated rest and generally functions best aligned with daylight. The factory system was the first major human institution to declare quite openly that this biological reality was now negotiable, that machinery's needs could simply be placed ahead of a body's preference for sleeping when it is dark, and that human workers would be reorganized in shifts to accommodate a machine that felt no exhaustion at all. Night shift work in these early factories carried a particular specific brutality that deserves to be named honestly. Workers assigned to night shifts, often including children as young as 6 or 7 in many British textile mills, of this period laboured through the same long hours as their daytime counterparts, but with none of the natural light that had governed nearly every human working life before them, and frequently with far less sleep during the day to compensate, since daytime, filled with the noise and demands of a working household, rarely offered the same quality of rest that night had once provided. Surviving testimony from parliamentary investigations into factory conditions conducted in Britain in the early 1800s as concern over child labour grew into a genuine political movement includes accounts from workers describing falling asleep at their machines, sometimes with devastating consequences, fingers and hands caught in unguarded equipment during moments of exhausted inattention that would have been unthinkable in a system built around the body's own natural rhythms rather than against them. Public concern over conditions like these eventually produced a slow and often contested series of legislative responses. Britain's Factory Act of 1833 placed limits modest by any modern standard, but genuinely radical for its time, on the hours children under a certain age could legally be made to work, and required at least some rudimentary provision for their education alongside their labour. Later acts extended similar protections further, gradually reducing legal working hours for children, and more slowly still for adult workers as well. Some mill owners responded to these new restrictions with an ingenious and rather unsettling workaround known as the relay system, in which children were organised into overlapping shifts, so that the machinery itself never had to pause even as any individual child's working hours technically remained within the new legal limit. The letter of the law was satisfied. Its underlying purpose, giving an exhausted child body genuine sustained rest, was in many mills, quietly circumvented a pattern that would repeat itself in various forms throughout the coming history of industrial labour regulation. Here is a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people when they encounter it for the first time. The technology that eventually lit homes and city streets across the industrialized world was not first installed for the comfort or convenience of ordinary families at all. It arrived years earlier inside factories specifically to extend the working day further into the night than firelight or candlelight had ever reliably allowed. A cotton mill in Salford near Manchester became one of the first factories in the world to install gas lighting throughout its working floors in the first years of the 1800s, years before gas lighting reached any ordinary street or home in significant numbers. The choice was economic and entirely deliberate. Gaslight burned brighter and more consistently than candles, produced less risk of fire in a building full of flammable cotton fibres, and crucially, made it practical to keep an entire mill running productively through hours that had previously been too dark to work safely in at all. Before an ordinary family anywhere in Britain enjoyed the benefit of artificial light bright enough to read comfortably, by after dark a child working a night shift in a cotton mill was already labouring beneath it for the machine's benefit rather than her own. There is a particular piece of resistance from this period worth pausing on, because it reveals just how unnatural this new relationship with time still felt to the people living through its earliest years. For generations before the factory system took hold, many working communities across Britain and parts of Europe had observed an informal, widely tolerated tradition sometimes called St. Monday, in which workers, particularly in trades organised around task rather than clock, simply did not show up to work on the Monday, following a weekend of drinking, socialising and rest, extending their break by an extra day, almost as a matter of course. Employers in the older pre-industrial economy had generally tolerated this practice, since work was still organised more around finished tasks than fixed hours. Factory owners dependent on continuous machine operation and coordinated shift schedules found St. Monday intolerable, and much of the early history of industrial labour discipline, including fines for absence, locked factory gates, and increasingly strict supervision, can be read as a sustained, deliberate campaign to stamp out this older, more forgiving relationship with time and replace it entirely with the rigid, unforgiving discipline the factory bell now demanded. The evidence suggests this campaign took the better part of a century to fully succeed, and scholars still debate exactly how quickly the practice actually disappeared across different trades and regions. But its eventual disappearance marks something significant: the final near-total victory of clock time over the older, more flexible rhythms this story has followed since its very first fire. Consider for a moment a girl of perhaps 10 years old working a night shift in one of these early cotton mills somewhere in Lancashire in the 1820s. She has been on her feet or crouched beneath moving machinery to clear jammed cotton fibres for hours. Already, the gaslight overhead casting a flat, steady glow across rows of spinning frames that never pause, never rest, never seem to feel anything at all. Her eyes ache with a heaviness she has stopped being able to fully fight, and somewhere behind that heaviness sits a specific learned fear of a machine that will not stop simply because her attention has slipped for a moment. What must it have felt like to be so young and already so completely subject to a rhythm that belongs not to the sun, not to the season, not even to her own body's honest need for rest, but to a wheel turning somewhere beneath the floor, indifferent to everything except its own continuous motion. The factory bell, or in many mills, the factory whistle, a piercing steam-powered signal that could carry for a considerable distance across an industrial town, became the new authority governing daily life in a way the medieval church bell, for all its early influence, had never quite managed to achieve. Entire towns grew up around a single dominant employer, their populations rising and retiring, not by the light of the sun, but by the timing of a single whistle, blown at the same fixed moment regardless of season, weather, illness, or how the previous night's rest had actually gone. Workers who had once measured a day loosely against sunrise and sunset now organised their entire lives, meals, sleep, family time around the precise, unforgiving schedule stamped onto a factory clock. A clock that, unlike a public town clock installed for shared civic benefit, existed specifically to extract the maximum possible output from every hour a worker's body was present and able to labour. It would be easy, sitting comfortably tonight, to imagine this transformation as something that happened quickly, a single dramatic break from an older world. The historical reality is slower and in its own way more unsettling. The shift from task-oriented sun-governed labour to clock-disciplined continuous industrial work unfolded gradually across roughly a century, spreading unevenly from textile mills to mines to eventually touch nearly every category of manual labour across the industrialising world, each new industry adopting shift systems and factory discipline a little more readily than the one before it, because by then an entire generation had already grown up knowing nothing else. Exhaustion, once tied so closely to the specific demands of a field or a season or a fire that needed tending, was becoming something else entirely, a permanent, structural feature of ordinary working life built directly into the architecture of an economy that had discovered in the water wheel and the steam engine a source of labour that genuinely never tired, and had decided quietly and almost without full public debate that human workers would simply have to learn to keep pace with it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion the factory system introduced that deserves its own quiet acknowledgement, distinct from anything a farmer or a weaver working at home had ever really known. Agricultural labour, however, grueling, still varied hour to hour and season to season, engaging different muscles, different tasks, different small decisions throughout a day. Factory labour, by contrast, was frequently reduced to a single repeated motion tending one part of one machine, for hour after hour after hour, with the pace of that motion set not by the worker's own body, but by the speed of the machine itself. Early observers of factory life, including some of the physicians who began studying industrial workers in the 1800s, described a distinct form of fatigue among machine operators that seemed to differ from ordinary physical tiredness, a dulled, monotonous exhaustion of attention itself, as much mental as muscular, that some contemporary writers described using words very close to what a modern reader might recognize as burnout centuries before that particular term existed. The evidence connecting this observed 19th century fatigue directly to modern understandings of monotony and attention remains a subject some historians of medicine still debate, since the underlying science of exhaustion was only beginning to be studied systematically during this period. But the pattern these early physicians described, a tiredness rooted less in effort than in relentless mind-numbing repetition, would prove to be an early sighting of something the industrialized world was going to become extremely well acquainted with in the centuries ahead. And keeping pace with the machine that never sleeps required eventually more than gaslight flickering across a mill floor. It required something that could push back against the darkness itself, everywhere, permanently, not just inside a factory built to outwork the sun, but in every home, every street, every corner of a city that was slowly, quietly learning to forget what true darkness had ever felt like. The mill floor had already shown what became possible once artificial light was bright enough and cheap enough to matter. The rest of the world watching was about to want the very same thing for itself. London's Pall Mall on a January evening in 1807 draws a curious, sceptical crowd gathered along the street to witness something almost nobody present has ever seen before: a row of lamps burning. Not with the familiar orange flicker of oil or tallow, but with a strange, steady, faintly bluish flame, fed by gas pipes directly through underground tubes from a source they cannot even see. Some in the crowd reportedly assume the demonstration is a trick or a danger or both. Within a generation, the same street lighting they gather to marvel at would be considered so ordinary that hardly anyone in London would think to look twice at it. Gas lighting had already proven itself inside the mills, where its economic logic was ruthlessly simple. More working hours meant more output, and a factory owner willing to install the necessary pipes and burners could effectively purchase additional hours of usable daylight regardless of the actual season or hour. Cities watching what factories had already demonstrated began to want the same thing for entirely different reasons: safety, commerce, and a kind of civic pride that had once been reserved for grand cathedral bells and public clocks. A city with well-lit streets could claim with some justification to be safer after dark than one relying on scattered private lanterns and the occasional night watchman's own small light. It could also quite practically keep its shops and theatres and taverns open later, extending the commercial day in a way that echoed on a civic scale, exactly what the factory whistle had already done to industrial labour. There is a detail worth pausing on here, because it reveals just how strange and even faintly threatening this new light initially felt to some of the very people who would soon come to depend on it without a second thought. A number of religious and moral commentators in early 19th century Britain expressed genuine unease about gaslighting's spread, some framing it in surviving pamphlets and sermons of the period as a kind of overreach, an attempt by human ingenuity to claim a dominion over darkness that had always by long custom and religious understanding belonged to a higher order entirely. Night in this older way of thinking was meant to end labour, to enforce rest, to remind human beings of their limits. A street that refused to fully go dark, filled with shoppers and workers and revellers well past what earlier generations would have considered a reasonable hour, struck some contemporary observers as something close to a small act of defiance against the natural order itself. The concern did not stop the technology's spread for even a moment, but it is worth remembering tonight that the transition into a permanently lit world did not feel inevitable or comfortable to everyone who lived through its earliest years. To many it felt like something being taken away quietly without anyone quite agreeing to the trade. It's worth noting, since popular memory tends to compress this transition into a single decisive moment, that gas did not simply surrender to electricity without a fight. In 1885, an Austrian chemist named Karl Auer von Welsbach developed the incandescent gas mantle, a small mesh sleeve, that when heated by an ordinary gas flame glowed with a brightness several times greater than any gas lamp had previously managed, dramatically narrowing the gap between gas and electric light for several more decades. Gas companies across Europe and North America invested heavily in this improved technology. And in many cities, gas lighting continued to hold its own commercially well into the early 1900s, a genuine sustained rivalry, rather than the swift foregone conclusion it can appear to be in hindsight. Even so, by the final decades of the 1800s, a new and even more consequential form of artificial light was already beginning its own march into ordinary life, and its story is considerably messier and considerably more contested than popular memory tends to preserve. Thomas Edison is widely remembered as the inventor of the incandescent light bulb, and his laboratory in Menlo Park did produce in 1879 a working commercially practical version capable of burning for a genuinely useful length of time. But scholars of this period are careful to note that Edison was not working in isolation, nor was he first. Several other inventors, including Joseph Swan in England, had already developed functioning incandescent bulbs of their own in the years just before, and the specific historical question of who most truly deserves credit for the invention remains even now a matter some historians continue to debate, shaped as much by patent battles and business rivalries as by any single clean moment of discovery. What Edison contributed beyond the bulb itself was arguably more consequential still: an entire practical sealed system for generating and distributing electricity to power it at scale, beginning with the Pearl Street Station in Manhattan, which began supplying electric light to a small district of Lower New York in 1882. Consider for a moment what it must have felt like to be among the very first ordinary residents of that small illuminated district, flipping a switch inside your own home for the first time, and watching a room fill with steady, clean, flameless light. No wick to trim, no flame to fear, no smell of burning oil clinging afterward to curtains and clothing. Picture a mother in a modest apartment somewhere in that small illuminated district of Lower Manhattan, standing in her kitchen on the evening her building's new wiring is finally switched on, watching her children gather around a single bare bulb, hanging from the ceiling, staring up at it with an open, uncomplicated wonder that no candle or oil lamp had ever quite managed to produce. She reaches up and turns it off, then on again, simply to watch it happen, the room plunging into familiar dusk and then flooding back into a steady, even brightness that asks nothing of her. No trimming, no refilling, no careful shielding from a draught. For a woman who has spent every evening of her life until this one tending some small demanding flame, the sheer effortlessness of this new light must have felt less like a convenience and more like something bordering on magic. For centuries, light after dark had meant fire in one form or another, with all the danger, expense, and constant tending that fire demanded. Electric light offered something genuinely new in the long history this evening has traced illumination that required almost no ongoing human labour at all. Once the infrastructure existed, light that simply arrived on command, indifferent to wind or weather, or the tedious daily ritual of wick trimming that had occupied a portion of nearly every evening for every household throughout recorded history before it. The spread of electric lighting into public and civic life reached one of its most theatrical early moments at the World's Columbian Exposition held in Chicago in 1893, where organizers illuminated the fairgrounds with an almost unimaginable number of electric lights, transforming the exposition grounds after dark into what visitors and journalists of the time began calling the White City, a vision of a nighttime world so brightly and completely lit that some attendees reportedly wept at the sight of it, overwhelmed by an experience of nighttime brilliance nothing in their prior lives had prepared them for. Millions of people travelled specifically to witness this spectacle, and many returned home afterward, carrying an entirely new concrete image of what a fully electrified night could look like, an image that would shape public appetite and civic ambition for decades to come. It is difficult to overstate how genuinely novel this must have felt. For the entire span of human history this story has walked through tonight, night had meant darkness softened only by fire, moonlight and the small hard-won pools of light a household or a town could manage to produce. The White City suggested for the first time on any meaningful scale that darkness itself might simply become optional. What followed across the closing years of the 1800s and the opening decades of the 1900s was a steady and increasingly rapid extension of electric light into ordinary homes, streets and businesses across the industrialized world. Though the pace of that spread varied enormously depending on wealth, geography and access to the infrastructure required to deliver it. Wealthy urban households electrified first, often years or even decades before rural communities gained reliable access, a gap that in some regions of the United States and Europe would persist well into the middle of the 20th century. The evidence on exactly how this uneven spread shaped differing regional patterns of sleep and daily rhythm remains somewhat incomplete, since detailed sleep records from ordinary rural households of this period are relatively scarce. But historians studying the period generally agree that electrification tracked closely alongside a broader lengthening of the ordinary waking day, particularly in cities where shops, theatres, restaurants, and eventually factories operating around the clock all took increasing advantage of light that no longer had to be conserved or feared. Diaries, household account books, and early social surveys from this period offer scattered but fairly consistent evidence of average bedtimes drifting later, across the decades bracketing the turn of the 20th century, particularly among urban populations with reliable access to artificial light. A typical working household that might once have settled in. Not long after sunset, increasingly stayed active an hour or two beyond that, then eventually 2 or 3, the exact margin varying by class, city and country, but the general direction remarkably consistent wherever electrification had taken hold. None of this happened through any single decision or decree. It accumulated quietly, one lit room and one late evening at a time, until an entire population had gradually, almost imperceptibly, renegotiated its relationship with the hour it considered reasonable to finally go to sleep. Newspapers offer one particularly vivid illustration of how deeply this new relationship with artificial light reshaped ordinary working life. Large city newspapers needing to print enormous print runs overnight in order to have copies ready for morning delivery became some of the most electrically demanding and most thoroughly nocturnal workplaces of the early 20th century, with entire shifts of typesetters, pressmen and delivery workers labouring through hours that only a century earlier an entire town might have spent almost universally asleep. The bright, humming, indifferent light of an electrified press room running at 3 or 4 in the morning to meet a deadline set by nothing more sentimental than a commuter's breakfast table represents in miniature exactly what this whole evolving relationship with artificial light had been building towards since the first flickering demonstration on Pall Mall. Night was no longer simply the absence of day. It had become for a rapidly growing share of the working world simply another shift. Retail life transformed alongside it in ways that reshaped the ordinary texture of a city evening. Large department stores in cities like New York, London, and Paris began investing heavily in electrically lit window displays through the final years of the 1800s, discovering that a brightly illuminated shop window glowing warmly against a dark street drew crowds of admirers even long after the store itself had closed for the night. Window shopping as a genuine, named leisure activity essentially depended on this new technology to exist at all, since there had previously been little reason to walk city streets after dark simply to look at merchandise no one intended to buy until morning. Evening itself for a growing urban middle class began to feel less like the natural close of a day and more like an entirely separate span of time, one with its own entertainments, its own fashions, its own rhythm, carved out almost entirely by the presence of reliable, affordable light. Staying out late, once associated mainly with taverns as criminal opportunity or genuine necessity, gradually acquired a new, almost fashionable respectability among the urban, middle and upper classes. A shift some social historians trace directly to the sense of safety and spectacle electric lighting brought to city streets after dark. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, something this evening's story keeps circling back toward from a slightly different angle each time. Every technology traced so far, the fire, the bell, the clock, the mill, the gas lamp, and now the electric bulb, promise some form of mastery over the same basic problem: darkness, danger, and the body's own stubborn need for rest. And each time that mastery arrived, carrying a quiet cost that took much longer to notice than the benefit did. Is it possible that a species which spent nearly the whole of its existence learning to fear and respect the dark simply never developed the instincts necessary to know when enough artificial light was, in fact, enough? Because underneath all of this brightness, humming quietly beneath every gaslit street and every electrified press room, a body inherited from those earliest watchful nights around an open fire was still there, still responding on some deep and largely unconscious level to light and dark in ways that no amount of clever engineering had actually managed to switch off. That body and the ancient patient biology still running quietly underneath it was about to become the subject of a very different kind of investigation altogether, one that would finally begin asking with real scientific tools exactly what all of this borrowed light had actually been costing it the entire time. The question had been sitting there patiently since the very first watchful night by an open fire. It would simply take modern instruments and modern curiosity to finally begin writing down the answer. The University of Chicago in the early decades of the 1900s becomes home to a physiologist named Nathaniel Kleitman, a man whose name is barely known outside the field he helped invent, though nearly everything modern science understands about sleep traces, back in one way or another, to a laboratory he built almost from nothing. Kleitman arrived at the study of sleep at a moment when it was barely considered a legitimate subject for serious scientific investigation at all, treated by much of the medical establishment as a simple, uninteresting absence of wakefulness, rather than an active, structured process worth studying in its own right. He spent decades quietly changing that, and one of his most extraordinary experiments took him, along with a graduate student named Bruce Richardson, deep beneath the earth, into Mammoth Cave in Kentucky in the summer of 1938. The two men lived inside the cave for more than a month in a chamber lit only by artificial light. They controlled themselves deliberately, cut off from sunlight, from any natural cue about the passing of day or night, in an attempt to answer a question that sits in some sense at the very heart of everything this evening's story has traced. Is the human sense of a day roughly 24 hours long something imposed on us entirely by the sun, or is it something the body carries with it regardless, an internal clock running quietly, whether or not any external light ever confirms it? Picture the two of them in that cave weeks into the experiment, seated at a small folding table beneath a single electric lamp they had carried down with them. The walls around them cool limestone that had not seen daylight in millions of years. The silence outside their small circle of light absolute in a way almost no surface-dwelling human ever truly experiences. They keep careful records noting body temperature, meals, moods, the exact moment each of them feels sleep finally arriving. All of it measured against a stretched artificial 28-hour day that neither man's body seems entirely willing to accept. There is something almost poignant in picturing two scientists deep underground, patiently negotiating with their own bodies over what a day actually is, the same fundamental question that had once been settled without any negotiation at all by nothing more than a rising and setting sun. The two men attempted to live on an artificially lengthened day of 28 hours, hoping to discover just how flexible the human body's sense of time truly was. Kleitman, older and more set in his ways, largely failed to adjust his body stubbornly, clinging to something closer to its familiar rhythm despite weeks of effort. Richardson Younger adapted somewhat more successfully, though even his adjustment remained imperfect and effortful throughout the experiment. What the two men discovered deep in that dark, sunless cave would prove to be one of the foundational insights of modern sleep science, that the human body carries its own internal sense of time remarkably close to 24 hours in length, and that this internal rhythm resists being reshaped by willpower or environment alone, even under carefully controlled experimental conditions designed specifically to bend it. That internal rhythm eventually acquired a name, the circadian rhythm, drawn from Latin words meaning approximately a day, and decades of research following Kleitman's early work gradually revealed where physically inside the human body this rhythm actually lives. In the 1970s, researchers identified a tiny cluster of roughly 20,000 neurons sitting deep within a region of the brain called the hypothalamus that functions as something close to a master clock, coordinating the timing of nearly every other biological rhythm in the body, from core temperature to hormone release to the sleepiness that gradually builds across a waking day. This structure, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, receives its primary input not from any internal sense of elapsed time at all, but from a direct connection to the eyes, meaning that light entering through the retina remains even now the single most powerful signal the human body uses to decide what time it believes it is. Everything this evening has traced the fire, the bell, the factory, the gas lamp, the electric bulb has in some sense been long, slow negotiation with this one small cluster of cells, a structure that evolved across an almost incomprehensible stretch of time to trust sunlight and sunlight alone as its primary evidence for how a day should be shaped. There is a particular, almost tender piece of scientific history connected to this same laboratory that deserves its own quiet telling. In 1953, a young researcher named Eugene Aserinsky, working under Kleitman's supervision, made one of the most significant discoveries in the entire history of sleep science, and he made it in part by observing his own 8-year-old son. Aserinsky had been experimenting with sensitive equipment capable of detecting small electrical signals from muscles around the eyes, and while monitoring his sleeping son one night, he noticed something that seemed to make no sense at all. Periods during sleep when the boy's eyes darted rapidly back and forth beneath closed lids in bursts, as though he were watching something unfold in front of him. Further study confirmed this was not an isolated occurrence, but a distinct, recurring stage of sleep present in every sleeping person. Tested a stage during which the brain shows patterns of electrical activity strikingly similar to full wakefulness, even as the body itself remains almost entirely still. This stage became known as rapid eye movement sleep, and its discovery overturned the older, simpler assumption that sleep was a single uniform state of reduced activity. Sleep, it turned out, contained its own hidden architecture, cycling through distinct stages many times across a single night, each stage serving a different, still not fully understood purpose. Scholars in this field continue to debate the precise function of rapid eye movement sleep, even now, with competing theories connecting it variously to memory consolidation, emotional processing, and the strange, vivid dreaming most people associate with this particular stage, without full agreement yet on which explanation or combination of explanations best accounts for what this part of the brain is actually doing each night. What makes all of this feel especially worth sitting with tonight is how directly it connects back to nearly everything this evening's story has already walked through. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, that small internal clock trusting light above almost everything else, evolved across the same immense stretch of time that shaped the watchful woman by her fire, the segmented sleepers of pre-industrial Europe, the monks waking for matins in the cold dark of a stone dormitory. It did not evolve for gaslight or electric light or the particular blue-tinted glow of a screen held close to the face in a dark bedroom. Researchers studying the effects of different wavelengths of light on the suprachiasmatic nucleus have found that shorter, bluer wavelengths, the kind emitted especially strongly by many modern electric light sources and electronic screens, suppress the release of a hormone called melatonin considerably more effectively than the warmer, longer wavelengths of firelight or candlelight ever did. Melatonin, released by a small gland deep in the brain, functions as one of the body's primary signals that darkness has arrived and sleep should be approaching. A body exposed to bright blue-rich light in the hours before bed is, in a very real physiological sense, still receiving something close to daylight information, telling the ancient patient clock inside it that the day has not yet ended, regardless of what a bedside clock or a calendar might actually say. Consider for a moment how strange this quiet biological negotiation actually is playing out every single evening inside nearly every person listening to this story right now. The body does not know, does not care whether the light filling a room comes from a sun 93 million miles away, or a small screen held 18 inches from the face. It simply receives the signal and responds according to instructions written across an almost unimaginable span of evolutionary time, long before anyone could have imagined a light source small enough to hold in one hand and bright enough to convince an ancient internal clock that morning had somehow impossibly arrived hours early. This same body of research eventually turned its attention toward a question with considerably heavier real-world consequences: the effects of long-term chronic disruption to this internal rhythm among people whose work required them to remain active through the night on a regular, sustained basis, echoing in a modern form exactly the kind of night labour this story traced earlier inside 18th century cotton mills and coal mines. Large-scale studies conducted across the late 20th and early 21st centuries following nurses, factory workers, and others engaged in rotating or permanent night shift work over many years began to document a consistent pattern of health differences compared to similarly employed daytime workers' differences. Researchers connect to the sustained, repeated conflict between an internal clock still oriented toward daylight hours and a work schedule demanding wakefulness through the deepest part of the night. In 2007, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, part of the World Health Organization, classified long-term night shift work involving circadian disruption as a probable contributing factor to certain health risks, a careful, measured scientific classification rather than an alarm bell, reflecting years of accumulated epidemiological evidence rather than any single dramatic finding. The evidence in this area remains an active and evolving field of study, and researchers continue to refine their understanding of exactly which aspects of night work carry the greatest impact and how individual variation in chronotype and genetics might meaningfully shift that impact from one person to the next. This same modern research eventually produced one of the most quietly moving findings in the entire field, one that reaches directly back to a story this evening has already told. In the early 1990s, a researcher named Thomas Ware, working with the National Institute of Mental Health, conducted an experiment in which volunteers spent an extended period, roughly a month, in conditions of 14 hours of enforced darkness each night, far longer than the artificially shortened nights most modern people surrounded by electric light typically experience. Within a few weeks, without any instruction or expectation on the matter, the sleep of Ware's volunteers began to naturally split into two distinct segments separated by a period of quiet, calm wakefulness in the middle of the night, remarkably similar in shape and character to the first sleep and second sleep described so consistently in the historical record centuries earlier. Subjects reported this middle waking period as peaceful rather than distressing, a state some described as unusually calm and meditative. What historians had pieced together from court records and old diaries, modern laboratory science, working from an entirely different direction, and with no knowledge it was confirming anything at all, had independently rediscovered in a small quiet room in Maryland. The two sleeps of the old world, it turns out, were never simply a cultural habit that vanished along with candlelight. They may be something closer to the body's own default setting, waiting patiently beneath centuries of electric light for the right conditions to reveal itself again. This same research also finally gave a name and a mechanism to something travellers had complained about anecdotally for as long-distance air travel had existed. Jet lag, once dismissed by some as mere tiredness or imagination, is now understood as a very literal, physiological consequence of asking the suprachiasmatic nucleus to accept within a matter of hours a day and night cycle it has had no time to properly negotiate with. The same ancient clock that once patiently followed a single sun, now forced to reconcile itself with the sun rising and setting on an entirely different schedule than its own internal expectation. Researchers studying circadian rhythms in modern populations, including flight crews and frequent long-distance travellers, have used exactly this understanding to develop carefully timed light exposure as one of the more effective tools for gently coaxing the internal clock toward a new schedule, treating light once again as the single most persuasive language that this ancient system has ever really understood. Individual variation tucked inside all of this shared biology turns out to be considerably more significant than earlier generations of sleep science initially assumed. Twin studies conducted over recent decades comparing identical twins raised in similar environments suggest that a meaningful portion of a person's natural chronotype, whether they tend toward earlier or later natural sleep and wake times commonly described using the informal language of larks and owls, appears to be shaped significantly by genetics, rather than simply by habit, discipline, or personal preference. This finding carries a small, quiet kindness worth pausing on. A person who has spent years feeling as though something is simply wrong with them, some failure of willpower explaining why mornings feel so much harder than they seem to for everyone else, may in fact be living inside a genuinely different biological rhythm, inherited rather than chosen, no more a personal failing than the colour of their eyes. Adolescent sleep research adds one more gentle, humanizing layer to this same picture. Researchers studying circadian rhythms across the human lifespan have found that the biological clock itself shifts measurably later during the teenage years, with many adolescents experiencing a natural hormonally driven pull toward later sleep and wake times that has little to do with rebellion or poor habits and considerably more to do with genuine temporary biological reality. A teenager who struggles to fall asleep before 11 at night and struggles equally to rise for an early school start is not, in the majority of documented cases, simply choosing defiance. They're in a very real, physiological sense, living temporarily inside a slightly different day than the adults around them. One that will gradually shift back toward an earlier rhythm as they move into their 20s. All of this careful, patient modern research, the cave experiments, the discovery of rapid eye movements, sleep, the identification of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the studies of shift workers and twins, teenagers, amounts to something quietly remarkable when placed alongside everything this evening's story has already walked through. Centuries of watchful nights around open fires, segmented sleep in pre-industrial cottages, monks rising for matins, children labouring beneath gaslight in cotton mills, all of it now finds itself in a sense explained and validated by careful modern instruments confirming what the body seemed to have been, quietly insisting on the entire time, that it was never simply a passive vessel for whatever schedule the world happened to impose on it, but an ancient, stubborn, remarkably consistent system still running, still listening for the sun, long after the sun stopped being the only thing capable of telling it what time it was. And once historians armed with this modern understanding turn their attention back toward the old half-forgotten record of how people actually slept across the centuries, this evening has traced. They began to notice something that raised an entirely new and rather fascinating question of its own, about just how much of what once looked like ordinary human behavior might in fact still have secrets left to reveal. The record, it turns out, still had a few things left to say, if anyone was patient enough to read it again with fresh eyes. The record, as it turned out, had one more layer of complexity waiting inside it, one that the historians and scientists working on this puzzle would spend the next several decades quietly, respectfully disagreeing about. Roger Ekirch's research into the two sleeps of pre-industrial Europe and Thomas Ware's laboratory findings confirming that segmented sleep could re-emerge naturally under conditions of extended darkness, together painted what seemed for a while like a remarkably tidy picture. Segmented sleep looked like humanity's ancient universal default, suppressed only in recent centuries by artificial light, waiting patiently beneath the surface of every modern sleeper to reassert itself the moment conditions allowed. It was a compelling story, and it spread widely, embraced by writers, journalists, and more than a few well-meaning wellness advocates, eager to explain why so many people wake at 3 a.m. feeling that something ancient and forgotten was trying to reassert itself. Then, in 2015, a researcher named Jerome Siegel, working with colleagues at the University of California, Los Angeles, published a study that complicated this tidy picture considerably. Siegel and his team travelled to study 3 present-day hunter-gatherer and forager societies living without electricity or modern schedules, the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia groups whose daily lives in terms of light exposure and technology arguably resemble something closer to humanity's ancestral condition than nearly any other population left on Earth. Using sleep monitoring devices worn continuously over many weeks, the research team recorded in careful and methodical detail how these communities actually slept night after night, without any artificial suggestion or expectation about what the researchers hoped or expected to find. The results surprised a great many people who had assumed following Ekirch's earlier work that segmented sleep would appear as the obvious ancestral pattern. Members of all 3 communities generally slept in a single largely consolidated period each night, without the consistent middle-of-the-night waking period that had shown up so clearly and so consistently in the historical record from pre-industrial Europe. Siegel's data contained a second surprise, arguably even more startling than the first one, that challenges an assumption many people carry without ever quite examining it. It might seem reasonable to assume that people living without electric light, artificial distraction, or the demands of a modern schedule would naturally sleep considerably longer than the average modern adult. The data suggested otherwise. Members of the Hadza, San, and Tsimane communities averaged roughly 6.5 hours of sleep per night, a figure remarkably close to, and in some cases even slightly below average sleep duration, reported among many modern industrialized populations. None of the 3 groups showed evidence of clinical insomnia or chronic sleep deprivation as understood in a medical sense, and members generally reported feeling adequately rested. The finding complicates a story many people find intuitively appealing, that modern life has simply stolen hours of sleep our ancestors once enjoyed freely. The evidence suggests something more nuanced, that roughly 6 to 7 hours of sleep taken in a single consolidated block may itself sit well within the range of ordinary healthy human variation, rather than representing some tragic modern shortfall from an imagined ancestral abundance. Picture for a moment an evening among the Hadza gathered, as researchers have often described, around a small fire, well after the sun has set. Adults and children alike still very much awake, talking, laughing, telling stories that stretch on for an hour or more past full darkness before anyone moves towards sleep at all. Sleep in this setting does not arrive with the sun's disappearance. It arrives later after a genuine valued period of shared evening life around the fire, remarkably similar in spirit if not in exact shape to that quiet waking hour once spent by candlelight in a pre-industrial European cottage centuries later. Perhaps what both traditions share across such enormous distances of time and geography is not any single fixed sleep architecture at all, but something simpler and warmer, a shared, deeply human instinct to hold on to a little unhurried time in the dark before finally letting sleep take over. This creates a genuine, honest puzzle, and it is worth sitting with it exactly as it is, rather than smoothing it over into false certainty in either direction. Ekirch's historical evidence drawn from hundreds of court records, diaries, medical texts, and literary references across centuries of European life is not in serious dispute as historical evidence. People in pre-industrial Europe really did speak plainly and repeatedly of a first sleep and a second sleep, exactly as this story described earlier tonight. There's laboratory findings showing segmented sleep re-emerging under conditions of extended artificial darkness are similarly well documented and have been discussed extensively within the field. And Siegel's fieldwork among modern hunter-gatherer communities showing largely consolidated sleep in 3 separate carefully studied populations is equally rigorous. All 3 bodies of evidence appear to be true. The genuine scholarly disagreement lies not in whether any of them happened, but in what they mean when placed together, and what that combination tells us, if anything, certain at all about how humans slept across the deep undocumented stretch of prehistory before written records existed anywhere. Some researchers trying to reconcile these seemingly conflicting findings point toward a detail that might matter more than it first appears: the specific climate and latitude in which each piece of evidence was gathered. Pre-industrial Europe, particularly in its northern and central regions, experiences long, genuinely cold winter nights, often 14 hours or more of darkness during the deepest part of the season, hours during which there was simply very little productive activity available outside a shelter, and considerable incentive to remain indoors near a fire for the entire span of that darkness. The Hadzasan and Siman, by contrast, live far closer to the equator in regions where the length of night varies only modestly across the year, rarely extending much beyond the roughly 12 hours these communities would need for a single largely consolidated stretch of sleep regardless of season. Some researchers therefore propose that segmented sleep may never have been a single universal human default at all, but rather a flexible adaptation, one that merges specifically when the available period of darkness significantly exceeds a person's actual biological need for sleep. Precisely the situation Ware recreated artificially in his laboratory, and precisely the situation many pre-industrial Europeans faced naturally each winter. This remains honestly an open question rather than a settled one. Scholars in this field continue to debate how much weight to give 3 modern equatorial societies as evidence about ancestral human behavior more broadly. Since these communities, however useful as a window into certain aspects of a foraging lifestyle, are not identical replicas of the enormous range of environments early humans actually inhabited across tens of thousands of years in every inhabited continent. Some researchers caution that drawing firm conclusions about universal human sleep architecture from any small handful of present-day communities, however, carefully studied risks overstating what the evidence can actually support. The honest answer for now sits somewhere in the genuinely uncertain space between Ekirch's rich historical record and Siegel's careful modern fieldwork, a reminder that even a subject as intimate and universal as sleep still holds real, unresolved questions for the people who study it most closely. This kind of honest, unresolved disagreement is worth naming plainly because it says something true and rather comforting about how careful good faith science actually works, especially on a subject as old and as personal as sleep. It would be simple and in some ways more satisfying to end this part of the story with a single clean answer. A definitive statement about exactly how every human being once slept before candles and clocks and electric light reshaped everything. The genuine record does not offer that certainty, and pretending otherwise would do a disservice to the careful, patient work of everyone who has spent years gathering it. What the record does offer instead is something arguably more valuable, a picture of human beings across thousands of years and every inhabited climate on Earth, continually adapting the same basic need for rest to whatever specific conditions their particular corner of the world happen to present them with. There is a related pattern worth bringing into this same conversation, one that complicates the picture even further and in its own way adds a note of real warmth and human ingenuity to this evening's story. Rather than splitting the night into two sleeps separated by a waking hour, a number of cultures across history chose instead to split the day itself, carving out a period of rest not in the deep hours of darkness, but in the hottest, most punishing hours of daylight. Ancient Roman writers referred to a customary midday rest taken during the 6th hour of the day counted from sunrise, a period that gave the modern Spanish word siesta its root, and this same instinct to pause and withdraw from the punishing heat of early afternoon appears independently across an enormous range of cultures and climates, from the Mediterranean world to large parts of Latin America, to communities across the Middle East and South Asia, wherever the midday sun makes sustained outdoor labour genuinely dangerous rather than merely uncomfortable. The tradition proved remarkably durable across centuries, though its modern history carries its own small, quiet tension worth noting. Spain, perhaps the country most closely associated with the siesta in the popular imagination, saw the practice come under genuine pressure across the 20th century, as industrialization, urban commuting, and the eventually integration into broader European economic schedules made a lengthy midday closure increasingly difficult to reconcile with modern business hours. Some Spanish companies and government offices moved gradually and not without public debate toward a more continuous working day resembling the schedule common elsewhere in Europe, and surveys conducted in recent decades suggest that a genuine, lengthy midday rest has become considerably less common among working adults in Spanish cities than popular stereotype still assumes, even as the word siesta itself remains firmly affectionately embedded in the culture's own sense of itself. It is a small telling echo of nearly everything this evening has already traced another old sensible rhythm, gradually giving ground to the steady indifferent pull of the modern clock. Not every culture that developed a tolerance for daytime rest built it around heat at all, which suggests the underlying human impulse runs deeper than climate alone. In Japan, a long-standing cultural practice known as inamuri, roughly translating to something like present while sleeping, permits brief visible dozing in public settings, including meetings and workplaces, under a set of unspoken social rules quite different from anything common in Europe or North America. Rather than being read as laziness or disrespect, a brief nap taken openly at one's desk has traditionally been interpreted within this particular cultural framework as a subtle sign of dedication, evidence that a person has been working themselves to the point of near exhaustion in service of their responsibilities and has simply reached the point where the body's own need for a short rest could no longer be denied. The same physical act, closing one's eyes briefly in a public, professional setting, carries almost entirely opposite social meanings, depending on which culture happens to be watching, a small but genuinely striking reminder that exhaustion itself, however universal the underlying biology, has never been interpreted the same way twice across the wide range of human societies this evening's story has moved through tonight. Picture for a moment a market town somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, perhaps in the 1600s, its narrow stone streets filled with vendors and shoppers through the cool hours of morning, and then as the sun climbs toward its highest, harshest point, a kind of collective unspoken agreement settles over the entire town. Shutters close, Shop fronts darken. The street so crowded only an hour earlier, empty almost entirely as an entire community withdraws indoors into whatever shade and coolness can be found to rest through the hours when working outside would risk genuine harm from the heat itself. This is not laziness, and it was never treated as such by the communities who practiced it. It is simply a different, equally sensible answer to the same underlying question this whole evening has been quietly circling. How does a body find rest inside a world that does not naturally offer an unbroken block of safe, comfortable hours for it? What makes this particular adaptation so interesting, sitting alongside the segmented night sleep of pre-industrial Europe, is how clearly it demonstrates that human beings have never approached the challenge of rest with only one available solution. Where Northern Europe split its long winter night into two sleeps around a peaceful waking hour, Mediterranean and tropical communities split their day around a peaceful sleeping hour, each strategy responding sensibly to an entirely different environmental pressure, cold darkness in one case, punishing heat in the other. Is it possible that the real ancestral human pattern was never a single fixed architecture at all, but something more like a flexible toolkit, drawn on differently depending on where in the world a person happened to be sleeping and what particular challenge their local climate presented? This flexibility appears to run even deeper than climate alone. Some researchers studying napping behavior across cultures have noted that even communities without an extreme midday heat problem frequently maintain some form of shorter daytime rest as a normal, unremarkable part of ordinary life, suggesting that the human tendency toward a brief afternoon dip in alertness, something modern chronobiology now understands is tied to a genuine, measurable dip in the body's own circadian signal, roughly 7 or 8 hours after waking, may itself be a real biologically rooted phenomenon that different cultures have simply chosen or not chosen to formally accommodate. A culture with a siesta tradition is not fighting against this natural afternoon dip. It is working with it openly and without apology in a way that stands in fairly stark contrast to modern industrialized culture, which tends to treat the very same afternoon slump as a personal failing to be pushed through with caffeine rather than a shared predictable biological rhythm worth honouring. All of this leaves this evening's story in an honest and rather fitting place to pause and reflect. The deeper this history digs into the actual record, the less it resembles a single simple story with one correct answer, and the more it resembles something closer to the truth of most human history, a patchwork of different communities in different climates arriving at different but equally reasonable solutions to the same fundamental problem. A body that needs rest inside a world that has never fully cooperated with that need. Segmented night sleep in the cold north. Consolidated single sleep near the equator. A shared midday pause in the punishing heat of the Mediterranean and beyond. None of these represents the one true hidden pattern human beings were always secretly meant to follow. They represent instead the same patient, adaptable intelligence this evening has traced from the very first watchful fire, an intelligence that has never demanded a single universal answer, only a workable one shaped by whatever particular darkness or heat or danger a given place and time happen to present. And that same patient, adaptable intelligence, having spent this entire evening bending and reshaping itself around fields and bells and factories and light bulbs, and now the honest, unresolved edges of its own scientific study, was about to face one final cumulative reckoning, a century unlike any that came before it, one that would gather nearly every thread this story has followed tonight and press them all together, all at once into the daily life of nearly everyone still listening. The fires, the bells, the mills, the bulbs, the careful modern instruments still puzzling over what they have found, all of it was about to converge within the span of a single crowded century into something this story has not yet fully named, a world at war, an economy running around the clock, and a kind of exhaustion that would eventually come to feel less like an occasional hardship and more like simply the ordinary permanent condition of modern life itself. A world at war once it arrived did not simply add to everything this evening's story has already traced. It accelerated all of it at once, compressing decades of gradual change into a handful of desperate, urgent years. The First World War, beginning in 1914, placed demands on industrial production that peacetime economies had never remotely approached, and munitions factories across Britain, France, Germany, and eventually the United States responded by adopting round-the-clock operation on a scale the world had not yet seen. Shells, rifles, uniforms, and countless other supplies needed to reach the front in quantities that made anything resembling a conventional working day genuinely impossible to maintain. And factory owners, government officials, and workers themselves largely accepted as a matter of wartime necessity a level of continuous shift work that peacetime labour movements had spent the better part of a century fighting to limit. Women entered these round-the-clock factories in unprecedented numbers, filling roles left vacant by men sent to fight, and in doing so absorbed directly into their own bodies an exhaustion that had until this point remained more heavily concentrated among the working-class men who had staffed earlier generations of mills and mines. The Second World War, a generation later, repeated this same pattern on an even larger scale, and its cultural memory in the United States in particular has left behind an enduring image that deserves a moment of honest examination here. The figure of Rosie the Riveter, immortalized in wartime propaganda posters and popular memory as a symbol of determined, capable female industrial labor, represented something real. Millions of American women genuinely did enter factory work during these years, often on shifts that ran deep into the night to keep pace with wartime production demands. What the popular image tends to compress or soften, understandably, given its purpose as morale-boosting propaganda at the time, is the sheer physical toll that sustained shift work exacted on these women, many of whom were also managing households and children largely without the support of husbands serving overseas. War, it turns out, did not invent a new kind of exhaustion. It simply widened, dramatically and rapidly, who was expected to carry the old one. Consider for a moment a woman working the night shift at an aircraft assembly plant somewhere in the American Midwest in 1943. Her hand steady around a rivet gun despite hours already spent on her feet beneath banks of humming fluorescent light. Her husband's last letter tucked into her coat pocket in the small changing room down the hall. She has 2 children waiting at home with her own mother, who watches them through the long hours of her shift, and by the time she finally walks out into the grey early morning light after her shift ends, she has perhaps 4 or 5 hours before she needs to be awake again to see her children before school. She does this 6 nights a week, understanding it as a plain necessary contribution to something larger than her own comfort. There is a particular figure from this broader era whose personal philosophy towards sleep deserves its own careful telling, because his influence reached far beyond his own laboratory and in a real sense still echoes through modern attitudes about rest. Thomas Edison, whose incandescent bulb and electricity distribution system this story has already traced, held, and publicly promoted a genuinely striking personal belief about sleep itself. He considered it, by his own repeated description in interviews and writings, largely a waste of time, a leftover primitive habit inherited from a prehistoric era when the human body had nothing productive to do once darkness fell. Edison claimed across numerous public statements to sleep only around 4 hours a night himself, treating this as evidence of both his own exceptional discipline and a genuine model other ambitious people ought to aspire toward. He framed his own invention, electric light, explicitly as a tool for human liberation from what he saw as an unnecessary biological burden. Edison's attitude towards sleep found an unexpected intellectual companion in the work of an American engineer named Frederick Winslow Taylor, whose ideas developed in the final years of the 1800s and the early years of the 1900s would reshape industrial labor almost as thoroughly as the factory bell had a century earlier. Taylor, often credited as the founder of what became known as scientific management, approached the question of human labor with a stopwatch literally in hand, timing individual workers performing individual tasks down to the fraction of a minute, breaking each job into its smallest measurable components in search of the single most efficient sequence of motion a human body could perform. His methods treated the worker's body less as a person with its own needs and rhythms, and more as a component within a larger machine, one whose performance could and should be optimized the same way an engineer might optimize any other piece of equipment on a factory floor. Here is a detail worth sitting with carefully because it complicates the tidy version of Edison's own legend in a genuinely interesting way. Several biographers and researchers who have examined Edison's actual daily habits more closely, drawing on the accounts of assistants and colleagues who worked alongside him, describe a man who, despite his public claims of minimal sleep, frequently napped during the day, sometimes multiple times, often stretched out on a cot kept in his own laboratory for exactly this purpose. It is worth remembering, too, that this same era saw the ordinary cup of coffee transform from a modest morning ritual into something closer to a functional tool for managing exactly the exhaustion Edison and Taylor's combined philosophy had helped normalize. Instant coffee developed in a commercially practical form in the early 1900s and produced at massive scale during both world wars to keep soldiers and war industry workers alert through long shifts, became by the middle of the 20th century a genuinely essential fixture of ordinary working life. The very concept of a scheduled coffee break, formally written into labor agreements and workplace norms across American and European industry by the 1950s, represents something quietly telling in its own right, a small sanctioned pause built into the working day, not to allow genuine rest, but specifically to allow a stimulant capable of temporarily overriding the body's own honest signals of tiredness. The evidence here remains somewhat anecdotal rather than rigorously documented in the way modern sleep research should require, and scholars examining Edison's biography continue to debate how literally to take his own public claims about his sleep habits, but the broader pattern that emerges is suggestive. A man who publicly, repeatedly and influentially argued that sleep was an inefficient relic best minimized through willpower may himself have been quietly, privately supplementing a shortened night with exactly the kind of daytime rest this evening's story has already traced across cultures from ancient Rome to modern Japan. This matters for reasons that extend well beyond one inventor's personal habits, because Edison's public philosophy towards sleep did not simply vanish with him. It fed directly into a broader cultural current already building across industrialized society, one that treated minimal sleep not as a biological cost to be managed, but as a badge of ambition, discipline, and moral seriousness. Some historians studying the cultural attitudes of early 20th century industrial capitalism have connected this current to older religious and philosophical traditions as well, particularly certain strands of Protestant thought that had for centuries before Edison's bulb ever existed associated diligent, sustained labor with moral virtue and idleness with a kind of quiet failing. Scholars continue to debate precisely how much weight to give this older religious inheritance in shaping specifically modern attitudes towards sleep and productivity, since so many overlapping forces were all pushing in a remarkably similar direction during these same decades. The post-war decades that followed, particularly across the prosperous middle years of the 20th century in the United States and much of Western Europe, might have seemed on the surface like an obvious moment for this pressure to finally ease. Wartime necessity had passed, wages rose, genuine leisure time in the form of paid vacation days and shorter standard working weeks expanded for many workers in ways earlier generations of factory labourers could only have imagined. And yet historians studying the actual use of this new leisure time note, a curious pattern, one that complicates any simple story about progress steadily restoring what earlier centuries had taken away. Much of this newly available time filled quickly with an ever-expanding array of consumer activity, television, shopping, organised recreation, social obligation, rather than with the kind of genuinely unstructured rest a farmer might once have taken on a rainy afternoon or a family might once have spent lingering by a fire. Free time, it turns out, is not automatically the same thing as rested time. What does seem clear, gathering all of these threads together, is that by the middle of the 20th century, a genuinely new cultural attitude towards sleep had taken firm root across much of the industrialized world, one that framed a full unhurried night of rest. Not as an ordinary biological necessity the way it had been understood across nearly every earlier century this evening has traced, but as something closer to a luxury, or worse, a mild personal failing, and a mission that a person simply lacked the discipline to push through and function on less. Consider what this represents held up against everything this story has already walked through tonight. For nearly the entire span of human history, exhaustion was understood almost universally as a natural consequence of circumstance-hard labour in a field a long night spent watching for danger, an infant who would not settle. Nobody moralized the farmer's exhaustion as evidence of weak character. The 20th century introduced something genuinely new into this long history, a moral framing of tiredness itself, in which needing rest, actually needing it, quietly became something to apologize for. This new moral framing found a companion in the second half of the 20th century in a genuinely useful scientific concept that somewhat ironically ended up reinforcing exactly the pressure it was designed to help people understand. Researchers studying sleep, including the American physician and researcher William Dement, one of the pioneering figures to build directly on Kleitman's earlier laboratory work, developed and popularized the concept of sleep debt, the idea that lost sleep accumulates in a measurable, quantifiable way over time, much like an unpaid financial obligation, continuing to affect cognitive performance and physical health until it is eventually repaid through adequate rest. Dement's own research tracking subjects across controlled periods of restricted sleep demonstrated convincingly that cognitive performance, reaction time and mood all measurably deteriorate under conditions of chronic sleep restriction, findings that have since been replicated and extended many times over by subsequent generations of sleep researchers. The science underlying this concept is genuinely well supported, but the specific language chosen to describe it, debt borrowed time, a deficit to be repaid, arrived at a cultural moment already primed to think about sleep in exactly these transactional terms. So here, gathered together at the close of this long historical thread, sits the honest, layered answer to a question. This evening's story has been circling since its very first quiet minutes. Why were humans always so exhausted? The answer, it turns out, was never a single cause. Ancient biology plays a real part, an internal clock built across hundreds of thousands of years to trust sunlight above nearly everything else, still running quietly beneath every modern life. Environmental necessity plays a part too. The simple, unglamorous fact that fields ripen on their own schedule, that infants wake regardless of how tired a parent already is. And layered on top of both of these older, more biological pressures, sits something considerably newer and in its own way more avoidable, a cultural inheritance stretching from certain older religious attitudes through Edison's personal gospel of minimal sleep, through wartime industrial necessity, through modern deep science's own accidentally transactional language. All of it quietly teaching generation after generation that needing rest is somehow a mark against a person, rather than a basic, unremarkable fact of being human at all? Is it possible, sitting with everything this evening has gathered so far, that a meaningful portion of modern exhaustion has less to do with how much sleep a person is actually getting, and considerably more to do with the quiet accumulated weight of believing they should not need as much as they genuinely do? That question, gentle and unresolved as it deliberately remains tonight, sits at the very centre of the final stretch of this evening's story. A stretch that will follow this same long thread of borrowed rest through the middle decades of the 20th century and into the crowded, always lit, always connected world many listeners tonight are falling asleep inside of right now, to see finally just how much of that old inheritance still quietly shapes an ordinary night today. It is a gentle question to carry forward, not an anxious one, the same way this whole evening has tried to carry every hard truth it has offered, with warmth, with patience, and with the quiet trust that understanding where a feeling comes from has always been the first kindest step toward finally making peace with it. Before the alarm clock became a fixture in nearly every bedroom across the industrialized world, an entire profession existed specifically to solve the very problem that clock would eventually take over, and its story deserves telling in full because it captures something this evening's long history keeps returning to the human instinct to look after one another through the vulnerable, unwatched hours of the night. In industrial towns across Britain from the earliest decades of the factory system well into the middle of the 20th century, a figure known as the knocker-upper walked the streets each morning, often hours before dawn, carrying a long, thin pole, sometimes tipped with wire or a small bundle of stiff bristles, and used it to tap gently but insistently on the upstairs windows of clients who had paid typically a few pence a week to be woken reliably in time for their factory shift. Some knocker-uppers used dried peas fired through a pea shooter instead of a pole, a method reportedly favoured for reaching higher windows without waking an entire street. The work demanded a genuinely remarkable memory, since a single knocker-upper might be responsible for waking dozens of households across a working morning, each requiring a slightly different time depending on their particular shift. This profession, so specific and so entirely dependent on one person's reliability and care, persisted in some parts of industrial Britain remarkably late into the modern era, with a small number of knocker-uppers reportedly still working into the 1970s in a handful of towns, even as mechanical alarm clocks had become widely affordable and common in most households decades earlier. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that this human solution outlasted the mechanical one for so long in certain communities, and the evidence on exactly why remains somewhat incomplete, since detailed records of individual working-class households from this period are relatively scarce. Some historians studying this profession suggest that the personal human reliability of a no-knocker-upper, someone who could adjust to a family's changing shift or notice if a household seemed unusually quiet in a way that might warrant concern, offered something a machine simply could not. A small thread of ordinary human care woven into what was otherwise an increasingly mechanized, clock-disciplined world. One of the better documented knocker-uppers of this era was a woman named Mary Smith, who worked the streets of East London using a long tapered pea shooter to rouse her clients, a trade she reportedly inherited from her own mother, and continued for decades walking her set route in the cold early hours, regardless of weather season or her own tiredness. Accounts describing women like Mary Smith suggest the profession was perhaps surprisingly to modern assumption disproportionately taken up by women in some industrial towns, a small steady source of income that fit around the rhythms of running a household during the daylight hours that followed. There is something quietly moving in picturing her working her own long, uncertain night, so that an entire street of neighbours could sleep just a little more calmly, trusting that a familiar gentle tap on the glass would arrive at precisely the right moment and not a minute before. The mechanical alarm clock itself has its own quietly charming origin story. The very first documented personal alarm clock in America is generally credited to a man named Levi Hutchins, a New Hampshire craftsman who built himself a device in 1787 capable of ringing at exactly one specific hour 4 in the morning, and only that hour, since Hutchins had built the device purely for his own personal habit of rising before dawn and had no interest in making it adjustable for anyone else's schedule. It would take nearly another century alongside the broader industrial demand for punctual clock-disciplined labour. This evening's story has already traced before adjustable mass-produced alarm clocks became a common and affordable household fixture. One further small addition to this mechanical lineage deserves mention since it introduced a genuinely new, and for many people quite welcome, negotiation between a body and its alarm. In 1956, the General Electric Company introduced what became known as the snooze alarm, a mechanism allowing a sleeper to silence the ringing for a further 9 minutes before it resumed offering it for the very first time in this evening's long history of external forces demanding punctual waking. A small sanctioned pause built directly into the technology itself, a brief negotiated truce between the clock's rigid schedule and the body's own honest ongoing need for just a little more rest. As the 20th century moved forward, another new technology arrived, though, that reshaped quietly and gradually exactly how a household spent its evening hours, extending the era's already lengthening waking day even further into the night. Television, which spread into the majority of American and European homes across the 1950s and 60s, introduced something genuinely new into the domestic evening. A scheduled, centrally organised source of entertainment that for the first time gave an entire household a specific and often quite late reason to remain gathered together and awake rather than drifting naturally towards sleep once the day's obligations were finished. The concept of prime time, carefully scheduled by broadcasters to capture the largest possible evening audience, effectively institutionalized a later, more structured bedtime across millions of households simultaneously. Broadcasters themselves seemed to understand exactly what they were doing. Network executives in these decades openly discussed programming strategy in terms of capturing and holding an audience deep into the evening, scheduling the most compelling content deliberately later in the broadcast day, specifically to delay the moment a household finally switched off its set and went to bed. A strategy some industry historians have compared directly to the earlier, more overtly commercial logic of an illuminated department store window dressed up instead in the more comfortable, homely language of family entertainment. Consider for a moment a family gathered in a small living room somewhere in suburban America in the early 1960s, the blue-tinted glow of a single television set the primary light source in the room. Children in pajamas sitting cross-legged on the floor, well past what their grandparents would have considered bedtime, parents settled on a sofa nearby, all of them held together awake by a broadcast schedule set not by anything in their own bodies, but by a network programming decision made in an office hundreds of miles away. It is a small, warm, entirely ordinary scene, and also quietly one more small link in the same long chain this evening as traced from the very first flickering fire. By the final decades of the 20th century, a genuinely new kind of pressure had begun layering itself on top of everything. This story has already gathered, one that had less to do with any single light source or entertainment schedule, and considerably more to do with the increasingly interconnected structure of the global economy itself. Financial markets coordinating trading activity across exchanges in Tokyo, London, and New York effectively created a genuinely continuous 24-hour trading day for the global financial system as a whole, even though no single trader anywhere was expected to personally remain awake through all of it. Customer service and technical support industries following a similar logic increasingly adopted round-the-clock staffing often distributing shifts across call centers located in different countries specifically so that some portion of an international workforce would always be awake and available. This global, continuously operating economic structure represents, in a sense, the largest and most impersonal version yet of the same basic demand this evening's story has traced since the very first water-powered cotton mill, that human bodies reorganize themselves around a system's needs rather than the reverse. Scholars studying the human cost of this genuinely global economic continuity note that its effects fall unevenly, weighing most heavily on workers in call centers' logistics and international coordination roles whose personal schedules must bend to accommodate colleagues and clients in distant time zones. This same era of expanding global connection gave rise to another distinct modern form of exhaustion, one closely tied to the jet lag this evening's story examined earlier through the lens of circadian science. Business travel across long distances became, across the latter decades of the 20th century, a routine and often grueling expectation for a growing class of international professionals. The so-called red-eye flight, scheduled deliberately through the overnight hours to maximize a traveler's usable daytime on either end of the journey, represents perhaps the most literal possible expression of everything this evening has traced about the relationship between commerce and rest. Layered in on top of this global economic continuity came a final deeply personal technological shift, one that arrived for most people listening tonight well within living memory. A television, however late its programming ran, still eventually signed off, or at minimum offered a finite schedule a viewer could reasonably anticipate reaching an end. A smartphone, by contrast, offers no such natural conclusion. It carries instead an effectively endless supply of content, conversation, and notification available at any hour, competing directly and continuously against the ancient patient pull of an internal clock that evolved across hundreds of thousands of years to trust a darkening sky, not a glowing screen, as its primary signal that a day had finally genuinely ended. The push notification, a small alert capable of reaching a phone screen at any hour, regardless of whether the device's owner had actively opened any application at all, arrived as a standard feature across most major smartphone platforms by the final years of the 2000s, and its introduction quietly transformed the device from something a person checked at will into something that could at any moment, day or night, reach out and check on them instead. Researchers studying digital behavior in the years that followed began documenting a widespread, genuinely new form of low-grade anxiety connected to this shift, sometimes described using the informal shorthand of a fear of missing out. A medieval town crier called the hour once and moved on. A factory whistle blew and fell silent until morning. A smartphone resting quietly on a nightstand never entirely stops being capable of reaching into the dark. There is a particular irony worth sitting with quietly here, one this evening's story has been circling towards since it first introduced the concept of sleep debt several parts ago. The same decades that produced smartphones also produced an entire new industry of sleep tracking technology, wearable devices, and phone applications designed to monitor, measure, and optimize a person's rest with the same quantified precision Frederick Taylor once brought to a factory floor. Is it possible that even our most well-meaning modern attempts to protect and improve our own rest still carry quietly buried inside them the same old instinct to measure, optimize, and ultimately judge a process that for nearly the entire span of human history this evening has traced simply happened without any device at all keeping score? The evidence connecting sleep tracking technology's growing popularity directly to broader anxiety about rest remains an active and still developing area of study, and researchers continue to debate whether these tools genuinely help most users improve their sleep, or whether for at least some portion of users, the act of constantly monitoring and scoring one's own rest can itself introduce a subtle new form of vigilance uncomfortably reminiscent of the very watchfulness this evening's story began with all those centuries ago around a fire on an open, dangerous night. It is a gentle, unresolved question offered, here, without judgment toward anyone listening who might currently be wearing exactly such a device, since the underlying impulse behind it comes from an entirely reasonable and even quite tender place. What emerges gathering every thread this long evening has traced from that very first watchful fire to the glowing screen. Many listeners may be quietly setting aside. Right about now is a portrait of a species that has never stopped negotiating with the same basic ancient need carried forward across watchful nights, agricultural fields, monastery bells, cotton mills, gaslit streets, laboratory caves, world wars, and finally into pockets and nightstands everywhere. The clock beats on, patient as it has always been, still listening, for a sun that increasingly has very little say in the matter at all. And it is toward that quiet, patient clock and everything this long evening has learned about it that this story now finally begins its own slow, gentle turn toward rest, gathering everything it has gathered tonight into one last unhurried close. Nothing about that turn will ask anything more of the listener than simply staying exactly where they already are. Warm, unhurried, and finally gently ready to let the rest of this story carry them the remaining distance towards sleep. The fire in this story was never really about light. It was about someone deciding night after night that another person's rest mattered more than their own. That is where this evening began, in the deep grass of a world without walls, with a woman choosing to stay upright a little longer so her children could sleep undisturbed. Everything this story has traced since then, the fields, the bells, the mills, the bulbs, the wars, the screens, has been some version of that same choice made again and again by different people in different centuries for different reasons, but always circling back to the same quiet question. Who watches so that someone else can finally close their eyes? Sometimes the watcher was a mother listening through a fever in the dark. Sometimes it was a monk rising for prayer in a cold stone corridor because his faith asked it of him. Sometimes it was a child standing at a spinning frame beneath gaslight, watching not out of devotion, but because a machine demanded it and offered no choice in the matter at all. Sometimes it was a woman walking cold streets before dawn with a pea shooter in her coat pocket, making sure a street full of strangers woke exactly when they needed to. The shape of the watching changed. The underlying instinct, one person minding the dark so another person did not have to, never really did. There is something worth holding on to in that continuity, especially on a night like this one. History told honestly rarely offers clean lessons or tidy comfort. Fields failed. Empires that once felt permanent dissolved into names in a history book. Machines that promised to save human labour ended up asking more of the human body than any field ever had. Light that was supposed to liberate people from an old fear of the dark quietly taught an entire species to distrust its own need for rest. Power across every century this story has moved through proved far more fragile than it ever looked from the outside, a factory owner's schedule, a monastery's bell, a broadcaster's programming grid, each one certain of its own permanence, each one eventually giving way to something else. What endured underneath all of that fragility was not any single system or any single ruler's certainty. It was the ordinary people living inside those systems finding, generation after generation, some way to keep watching over each other anyway. There is a small, quiet piece of modern evidence worth ending on tonight, because it says something none of the earlier pieces quite managed to say on their own. In sleep laboratories today, researchers can now watch in real time exactly what a sleeping brain does when a sound reaches it in the dark. Even in a perfectly safe room, door locked, nothing threatening anywhere nearby, a sleeping brain still responds, still shows a small measurable flicker of heightened activity, a brief rising towards alertness before settling back down. Scientists studying this response describe it as a kind of built-in listening that sleep itself never fully switches off, an echo of exactly the same instinct that once kept a woman upright by an open fire, still quietly present, still quietly working inside a body lying safely in a locked, ordinary bedroom thousands of years and countless inventions later. The fire is gone. The instinct that once needed it never left. It is a strange thing to sit with, that a body can carry forward a fear its owner has never consciously felt, shaped by dangers that stopped existing for that particular family many generations ago. But it is also in its own way a kind of quiet honor. Every person listening to this story tonight carries somewhere inside them the accumulated care of every ancestor who ever stayed awake a little longer, so someone else could rest, every parent who tended a fire through a cold night, every watchman who called the hour into an empty street, every scientist who finally sat down to ask why any of it still mattered. None of that care was wasted. It simply moved quietly from one body to the next until it arrived tonight in you. The story slows now. There is nothing left to explain, only a picture held gently for a moment before the silence takes it. Somewhere long ago a fire is burning low. A woman sits beside it watching the dark. Behind her in the warmth her children sleep. She stays a little longer. Then at last she lies down beside them. The fire settles into embers, the night holds, nothing comes. And somewhere tonight in a quiet room, someone else finally closes their eyes, safe unwatched by anything except the dark itself, and the dark for once asks nothing of them at all.